The Imperium of mankind spans 1,000,000 worlds, each classified and catalogued by the vast bureaucratic machinery of the administratum. Among these countless designations, Agri-Worlds occupy a position of fundamental importance that often goes unrecognized by those who do not understand the sheer logistical nightmare of maintaining human civilization across the galaxy. These planets receive their classification based on their planetary tithe grade, a complex assessment that determines what each world must contribute to the Imperium's survival. For Agri-Worlds, this tithe focuses almost exclusively on foodstuff production, marking them as the breadbaskets upon which humanity's galactic empire depends. The Administratum's classification system operates through layers of bureaucratic assessment that can take decades to complete. When a world is designated as an agri-world, it means that adepts have determined its primary value lies in agricultural output rather than manufactorum production, mineral extraction, or human recruitment. This designation carries enormous weight. The world's entire administrative structure becomes oriented toward maximizing food production, from the organization of labor forces to the allocation of resources and the construction of infrastructure. Governor-generals of Agri-Worlds answer directly to specific branches of the administratum that monitor crop yields, storage capacity, and shipping schedules with the same obsessive detail that other imperial institutions track ammunition stockpiles or warship construction. The necessity for specialized agricultural worlds emerged during and immediately following the Great Crusade, when the Emperor's armies pushed outward from Terra to reclaim the scattered remnants of humanity. As the Imperium expanded at a pace unprecedented in human history, the logistical challenges became apparent to even the most optimistic administrators. Hive worlds, with their populations numbering in the hundreds of billions, consumed resources at staggering rates. Forge worlds dedicated their surfaces to manufactorums and refineries, leaving no room for food production. Mining worlds stripped their environments bare in pursuit of precious minerals. Naval stations and fortress worlds maintained populations that produced nothing but military readiness. The solution required specialization on a scale that matched the Imperium's ambitions. Worlds with favorable climates, stable weather patterns, and soil composition suitable for intensive farming received investment in agricultural infrastructure rather than industrial development. The Great Crusade's expansion had revealed thousands of planets that fit these criteria, worlds where human settlers had once farmed before Old Night's isolation cut them off from Terra. Many of these populations had regressed to pre-industrial agricultural societies, making their integration into the Imperium's food production network a natural progression rather than a forced transformation. The scale of food production required to sustain the Imperium defies easy comprehension. A single hive world might require daily shipments measured in millions of tons of grain, protein supplements, and processed nutrients. The Astra Militarum, spread across thousands of active war zones, consumes resources that would feed entire planetary populations. Naval vessels on extended patrol require stores that fill cargo holds the size of city blocks. The Administratum's calculations suggest that feeding the Imperium's trillions requires the output of tens of thousands of agri-worlds, each pushing their production capacity to sustainable limits and often beyond. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains the most direct relationship with agri-worlds among all imperial institutions. This branch of the Administratum carries responsibility for supplying the Imperial Guard with everything needed to wage the Emperor's wars, and food represents one of the most critical and challenging logistics requirements. A Munitorum logistics officer must coordinate shipments from hundreds of agri-worlds to supply a single crusade, accounting for transit times measured in months or years, the degradation of stored foodstuffs during warp travel, and the unpredictable demands of military campaigns that can shift suddenly across entire sectors. Munitorum representatives stationed on agri-worlds oversee the collection and preparation of tithes destined for military use. These officials maintain detailed records of harvest schedules, storage facility capacities, and shipping manifests. They work alongside Administratum adepts to ensure that military requirements receive priority without completely stripping worlds of the reserves needed for their own populations. The relationship between planetary governors and Munitorum officers often involves tense negotiations, as governors attempt to retain enough production to maintain their world's stability, while Munitorum representatives push for maximum extraction to meet the endless demands of distant battlefields. The food shipped from Agri-Worlds rarely resembles anything that could be called appetizing by the standards of Terra's privileged classes. Grain gets processed into dense, long-lasting blocks that can survive years in storage and the unpredictable conditions of warp transit. Protein comes from massive livestock operations or synthetic production facilities that transform plant matter into barely palatable supplements. Vegetables get reduced to vitamin-enriched powders and concentrates. The goal is not culinary excellence, but caloric density, nutritional adequacy, and resistance to spoilage. A guardsman's daily rations might consist of corpse starch biscuits, protein paste, and recaf, all produced on Agri-Worlds optimized for efficiency rather than taste. The Adeptus Ministorum has developed extensive theological frameworks around agricultural labor, elevating what might otherwise be seen as simple farming into acts of religious devotion. Ecclesiarchy preachers on Agri-Worlds deliver sermons that emphasize how each seed planted serves the God Emperor's will, how every harvest feeds his armies and sustains his realm. This theological interpretation serves multiple purposes within imperial society. It provides meaning and dignity to populations whose lives consist of endless agricultural labor. It reinforces the connection between individual effort and the Imperium's survival. It transforms the grinding work of feeding a galaxy into something sacred. Ministorum cathedrals on Agri-Worlds incorporate agricultural imagery into their architecture and decoration. Stained glass windows depict the Emperor as a divine farmer tending to humanity's garden. Saints associated with agriculture receive particular veneration, their feast days coinciding with planting and harvest seasons. Preachers invoke the Emperor's blessing over fields before planting begins, and harvest festivals become religious celebrations that blend ancient agricultural traditions with imperial creed theology. The ecclesiarchy understands that populations engaged in backbreaking labor need spiritual sustenance as much as physical, and it provides both through rituals that sanctify the agricultural cycle. This theological framework also serves to maintain order and productivity. Workers who view their labor as sacred service prove more resistant to the temptations of heresy or rebellion. The Ministorum's teachings emphasize that failing to meet production quotas does not merely represent an economic shortcoming, but a spiritual failing, a betrayal of duty to the God Emperor himself. This psychological pressure, combined with the very real threat of administratum punishment for worlds that fail to meet their tithes, creates powerful incentives for maximum productivity regardless of the human cost. The infrastructure required to transform a world into an effective agri-world represents a massive investment of imperial resources. Vast irrigation systems channel water across continents. Fertilizer production facilities operate continuously to replenish soil depleted by intensive farming. Storage silos rise like hive spires, capable of holding harvests measured in megatons. Orbital stations coordinate the transfer of foodstuffs to transport vessels, their docking facilities designed specifically for the specialized cargo haulers that carry agricultural products across the Imperium. Ground-to-orbit lifters run constantly during harvest seasons, moving processed food from planetary storage to waiting ships. Many agri-worlds maintain their own defense forces, though these typically rank as poorly equipped compared to the Astra Militarum, regiments they help feed. The Adeptus Munitorum generally assigns agri-worlds a low priority for military-grade equipment, reasoning that their value lies in production rather than combat capability. This creates a dangerous vulnerability that Xeno's raiders and heretic forces have exploited repeatedly throughout Imperial history. An agri-world lost to enemy action represents not just territory surrendered, but a significant reduction in the Imperium's ability to feed its populations and armies, potentially affecting dozens of worlds that depend on its output. The administratum's process for designating a world as an agri-world involves assessment criteria so complex that entire departments within the bureaucracy exist solely to evaluate potential agricultural planets. The classification begins with atmospheric analysis, measuring oxygen content, nitrogen levels, and the presence of trace gases that might affect crop viability or human worker health. The ideal atmospheric composition falls within narrow parameters: oxygen levels between 18 and 23%, sufficient nitrogen for plant growth, and minimal concentrations of sulfur compounds or heavy metals that could contaminate food production. Worlds with atmospheric compositions outside these ranges face immediate disqualification unless the Adeptus Mechanicus determines that terraforming efforts would prove cost-effective relative to the world's potential output. Soil fertility receives equally rigorous evaluation through indices developed over millennia of imperial agricultural experience. Administratum surveyors collect samples from multiple continental regions, analyzing mineral content, organic matter percentages, pH levels, and the presence of native microorganisms that might aid or hinder Earth-derived crop species. The Fertility Classification Index, a standard measurement across the Imperium, grades soil on a scale from alpha grade to epsilon grade. Most designated agri-worlds possess beta or gamma grade soil, adequate for sustained farming with regular fertilizer application and crop rotation protocols. Worlds with primarily delta or epsilon grade soil typically receive agricultural designation only when their strategic location justifies the additional investment in soil enrichment programs. Sustainable production capacity calculations attempt to determine how much food a world can generate annually without degrading its agricultural base to the point of collapse. These assessments factor in available arable land, water resources, native growing seasons, and the maximum population density supportable without consuming more than the world produces. The administratum's actuaries employ mathematical models passed down from the dark age of technology, modified through 10,000 years of practical experience. A world designated as an agri-world must demonstrate capacity to produce at least 5 times the caloric requirements of its own population, with the surplus designated for tithe shipment. Worlds falling below this threshold receive alternative classifications, though exceptions exist for planets producing specialty crops or luxury foodstuffs destined for the Imperium's upper echelons. The biosphere types found across imperial agri-worlds reflect the galaxy's environmental diversity and humanity's adaptation to countless ecological niches. Temperate grain worlds represent the most common classification, planets with seasonal cycles similar to ancient Terra, where wheat, barley, and other cereal crops thrive in vast continental breadbaskets. These worlds typically feature moderate temperature ranges, regular precipitation patterns, and soil compositions that respond well to traditional farming techniques. Their landscapes consist of endless fields stretching to horizons, broken only by processing facilities, worker habitations, and the occasional administratum monitoring station. The grain harvested from these worlds gets processed into the dense caloric blocks that form the foundation of imperial military rations and hive world food distribution. Tropical fruit-bearing planets occupy a different ecological niche, worlds where year-round growing seasons and high rainfall support continuous crop production. These agri-worlds cultivate fruits, vegetables, and protein-rich plants that require warm, humid conditions. The vegetation grows in carefully managed plantation arrangements, with different crop species planted in rotation to maximize soil utilization and minimize pest problems. Workers on tropical agri-worlds face different challenges than their counterparts on grain worlds: oppressive heat, high humidity that accelerates equipment corrosion, and aggressive native flora that constantly attempts to reclaim cultivated land. The food produced on these worlds often gets processed into vitamin supplements and preserved fruits that provide nutritional variety to populations otherwise subsisting on grain-based diets. Ocean-based algae farms demonstrate humanity's ability to exploit aquatic environments for food production. These agri-worlds possess minimal landmass, their surfaces dominated by seas where massive floating cultivation platforms harvest photosynthetic organisms. The algae gets processed into protein paste, nutritional supplements, and synthetic compounds used in food preservation. Orbital stations above these worlds coordinate the harvest schedules, monitoring ocean currents, water temperature, and algae bloom patterns across planetary scales. The populations on ocean agri-worlds live primarily on the cultivation platforms themselves or in underwater habitation domes, their entire existence oriented around maintaining the delicate balance of their aquatic farms. The food produced tastes particularly unpleasant even by imperial standards, but its nutritional density and production efficiency make ocean worlds valuable components of the Imperium's agricultural network. Fungus cultivation worlds exploit organisms that thrive in conditions unsuitable for traditional crops. These planets might possess minimal sunlight, high atmospheric moisture, or soil compositions that prevent normal plant growth but support massive fungal colonies. The Administratum designates such worlds for agricultural use when their location or existing infrastructure justifies the investment in specialized cultivation facilities. Workers tend vast underground caverns where engineered fungal species grow in darkness, fed on processed organic waste and mineral supplements. The resulting harvest gets dried, ground, and processed into fungal flour that serves as a protein source and food base. Some fungus worlds cultivate species originally discovered on feral worlds or death worlds, organisms that survived hostile environments through aggressive growth patterns and resistance to contamination. The distinction between primary and secondary agri-world classifications reflects the Administratum's recognition that pure agricultural specialization proves impractical for some planets. Primary agri-worlds dedicate 90% or more of their economic output to food production, with remaining resources allocated to maintaining the infrastructure and population necessary for agricultural operations. These worlds represent the Imperium's most productive breadbaskets, their entire societies organized around planting, harvesting, processing, and shipping food. Secondary classifications apply to worlds that combine substantial agricultural output with light industrial production, typically manufactorums producing farming equipment, food processing machinery, or the transport containers used to ship harvests off-world. Secondary agri-worlds often develop when the Administratum determines that a planet's resources allow for diversified economic activity without significantly reducing agricultural output. A world with extensive mineral deposits might maintain mining operations alongside its farms, using the extracted resources to manufacture tools and equipment locally rather than importing them from distant forge worlds. The classification system permits agricultural output as low as 60% of total economic production for secondary designations, though such worlds face higher tithe demands across multiple categories. Planetary governors of secondary agri-worlds navigate complex negotiations with different Administratum departments, balancing agricultural quotas against industrial production targets while managing populations split between farming and manufacturing labor. Terraforming efforts by the Adeptus Mechanicus have expanded the number of viable agri-worlds throughout Imperial history, though such projects require centuries of sustained effort and massive resource investment. The tech priests approach planetary transformation with the same methodical precision they apply to all endeavors, viewing worlds as machines that require adjustment to achieve optimal function. Atmospheric processors represent the most visible component of terraforming operations, massive installations that filter existing gases while introducing oxygen-producing organisms or chemical catalysts. These processors might operate for generations before achieving atmospheric compositions suitable for unprotected human habitation and agricultural activity. Soil enrichment programs employ both biological and chemical approaches to transform barren ground into arable land. The Mechanicus seeds target areas with engineered bacteria designed to break down rock into usable soil, a process that occurs over decades as microorganisms slowly convert mineral substrates into organic-rich earth. Chemical treatments accelerate this process, though the Mechanicus carefully monitors such interventions to prevent contamination that might render soil toxic to desired crop species. Some terraforming projects import soil from established agri-worlds, literally transplanting billions of tons of fertile earth to jump-start agricultural development on marginal planets. The Adeptus Mechanicus evaluates potential terraforming candidates through cost-benefit analysis that weighs projected agricultural output against the resources required for planetary transformation. A world located along critical supply routes might justify extensive terraforming investment even if its base characteristics prove marginal, while a planet in an isolated sector faces rejection despite favorable initial conditions. The Mechanicus maintains detailed records of successful and failed terraforming projects, using this data to refine their selection criteria and intervention techniques. Some worlds undergo partial terraforming, with the Mechanicus transforming specific continental regions while leaving other areas in their natural state, a compromise that reduces costs while still creating viable agricultural zones. The imperial tithe represents the fundamental mechanism through which the administratum extracts resources from every world under the emperor's dominion, and for agri-worlds, this extraction focuses almost exclusively on food production measured in standard nutritional units. The SNU system emerged during the early centuries of the Imperium as bureaucrats struggled to create a universal measurement that could account for the vast diversity of foodstuffs produced across a million worlds. A single SNU represents the caloric and nutritional content required to sustain one adult human for one standard Terran day, approximately 2,500 calories, along with minimum requirements for proteins, fats, vitamins, and minerals. This standardization allows administratum adepts to calculate tithe requirements and compare production efficiency across worlds growing radically different crops in completely different environmental conditions. The calculation methods employed by the administratum to determine each agri-world's specific tithe obligation involve layers of bureaucratic assessment that can take years to complete and decades to adjust. Adepts begin with baseline population surveys, counting not just the total inhabitants, but categorizing them by age, occupation, and caloric requirements. Agricultural workers performing heavy manual labor require higher nutritional intake than administrative personnel or children, and these distinctions factor into the calculations. The administratum then assesses total arable land, current cultivation percentages, soil fertility ratings, water availability, and climate patterns that affect growing seasons. Historical production data from previous tithes provides comparison points, though this information often arrives years out of date due to the vast distances and communication delays inherent in administering a galactic empire. Production capacity calculations attempt to determine the maximum sustainable output a world can achieve without degrading its agricultural infrastructure or exhausting its population through overwork. The administratum maintains theoretical models suggesting that an efficiently managed agri-world should produce between 8 and 12 times the nutritional requirements of its own population, with the surplus designated for tithe collection. Reality frequently deviates from these theoretical maximums. Worlds with older equipment, degraded soil, or inefficient labor organization struggle to meet projected outputs. Conversely, some agri-worlds exceed expectations through superior management, favorable environmental conditions, or the implementation of agricultural techniques that boost yields beyond standard projections. Strategic importance modifiers represent the most politically charged component of tithe calculations, introducing subjective assessment into what the administratum claims is an objective mathematical process. Worlds located along critical supply routes face higher tithe demands because their geographic position allows for more efficient collection and distribution of their output. Agri-worlds near active war zones receive temporary tithe increases to support military operations, though these emergency assessments sometimes become permanent as bureaucratic inertia prevents their removal once the immediate crisis passes. Planets that have demonstrated exceptional loyalty or provided crucial support during past conflicts might receive modest tithe reductions, while worlds with histories of compliance issues face punitive increases meant to discourage future resistance. The actual tithe assessment documents that planetary governors receive from the Administratum span thousands of pages of dense Gothic script, detailing not just the total SNU requirement, but breaking down specific crop types, processing standards, packaging specifications, and delivery schedules. A typical agri-world might face demands for millions of tons of grain delivered in moisture-sealed containers, meeting precise dimensional specifications, hundreds of thousands of tons of protein supplements processed to particular purity standards, and specific quantities of preserved vegetables or fruits packaged for long-term storage. The Administratum specifies delivery dates calculated in Terran Standard years, though the actual collection schedule depends on the arrival of transport vessels operating on routes that span multiple sectors. Chartist captains occupy an essential position in the economic structure connecting agri-worlds to the populations that depend on their output, commanding merchant vessels that ply hereditary trade routes established over millennia of imperial commerce. These captains inherit their roots and trading rights from their ancestors, maintaining commercial relationships that stretch back centuries or even to the Great Crusade itself. A Chartist captain's warrant grants exclusive rights to transport goods along specific routes, creating monopolies that the Administratum tolerates because they provide reliable, predictable shipping capacity. The alternative would require the Imperium to maintain its own massive merchant fleet, a logistical impossibility given the Navy's focus on military operations and the Mechanicus's prioritization of Forge World production. The vessels commanded by Chartist captains range from relatively small freighters capable of carrying a few thousand tons to massive bulk haulers the size of Imperial Navy cruisers, their holds converted into vast storage compartments designed specifically for agricultural cargo. These ships incorporate specialized systems for maintaining specific temperature and humidity levels, preventing spoilage during voyages that might last months or years depending on warp conditions and the number of stops along their route. The largest bulk haulers feature entire decks dedicated to grain storage, with automated systems that monitor for moisture accumulation, pest infestation, or spoilage indicators that might compromise the cargo before it reaches its destination. Chartist captains negotiate fees for their services directly with planetary governors or Administratum representatives, creating a complex market dynamic that operates within the constraints of imperial regulation. The Administratum sets maximum rates that captains can charge per ton of cargo transported, but these limits allow substantial variation based on route difficulty, distance, and cargo type. Perishable goods command higher rates than shelf-stable grain. Routes passing through sectors with active warp storms or Xenos raider activity justify premium pricing. Captains with particularly fast vessels, or those willing to accept riskier warp jumps to reduce transit time, can demand additional compensation. Planetary governors attempting to minimize shipping costs must balance their desire for economical transport against the reality that offending powerful Chartist families might result in reduced shipping capacity or delayed collections that cause tithe failures. The economic relationships between agri-worlds and their dependent populations create networks of mutual reliance that span entire segmentums, connecting worlds that might never directly communicate but whose survival depends on functioning supply chains. Hive worlds represent the most voracious consumers of agricultural output, their populations numbering in the hundreds of billions, crammed into urban sprawls that cover entire continents. These worlds produce nothing edible, their surfaces transformed into endless manufactorums, habitation blocks, and industrial wastelands. A single hive world might draw food from dozens of agri-worlds scattered across multiple sectors, with Administratum logistics officers coordinating shipments to ensure continuous supply despite the unpredictable nature of warp travel and the constant risk of shipping losses. Forge worlds maintain similar dependencies, They're populations of tech priests, servitors, and industrial workers requiring constant nutritional input despite producing no food themselves. The Adeptus Mechanicus approaches food consumption with characteristic efficiency, viewing nutrition as simply another resource input required for optimal human function. Forge worlds typically demand specific types of agricultural products that meet their exacting standards for purity and nutritional content, rejecting shipments that fail to meet specifications even if the food remains perfectly edible by normal imperial standards. This fastidiousness creates additional pressure on Agri-Worlds supplying Forge world populations, as governors must ensure their processing facilities maintain the quality control necessary to satisfy Mechanicus requirements. Naval stations and fortress worlds scattered throughout the Imperium maintain populations that exist solely to support military operations, and these installations depend entirely on imported food supplies. A naval base might house millions of personnel between ship crews, station staff, and military support workers, all consuming resources while producing nothing but military readiness. The Adeptus Munitorum coordinates food shipments to these installations, drawing from Agri-Worlds along established supply routes and maintaining strategic reserves meant to sustain operations if shipping disruptions occur. The Navy's demands for food supplies compete with civilian requirements, and during major military campaigns, Munitorum officers can requisition additional shipments from Agri-Worlds already operating at maximum capacity. The consequences of tithe failure cascade through multiple levels of imperial bureaucracy and enforcement, beginning with administrative investigation and potentially ending in planetary destruction. When an Agri-World fails to meet its tithe obligations, the initial response comes from administratum auditors who descend on the planet to determine whether the shortfall resulted from legitimate circumstances or deliberate non-compliance. These investigations examine harvest records, storage facility inventories, shipping manifests, and population data, comparing actual production against projected outputs. Auditors interview planetary officials, inspect agricultural facilities, and review decades of historical data-seeking patterns that might explain the failure. Legitimate causes for tithe shortfalls receive varying degrees of tolerance depending on their nature and the world's compliance history. Natural disasters, unexpected weather patterns, or pest infestations that destroy crops might result in temporary tithe reductions while the world recovers its production capacity. Equipment failures or infrastructure damage can justify extensions on delivery deadlines. However, the administratum approaches such explanations with deep suspicion, aware that planetary governors have every incentive to exaggerate problems to reduce their tithe burden. Auditors demand extensive documentation proving that claimed disasters actually occurred and affected production to the degree reported. Worlds that frequently cite problems face increasing skepticism and closer monitoring. Governors deemed responsible for tithe failures through mismanagement, corruption, or incompetence face removal from office, a process that the administratum executes with bureaucratic efficiency but little mercy. Replacement governors arrive with mandates to restore production levels and meet tithe obligations, often implementing harsh measures that previous leadership avoided. Labor quotas increase, rest periods shrink, and resources previously allocated to maintaining worker living standards get redirected toward maximizing output. The administratum cares nothing for the suffering these changes cause, viewing the planetary population as simply another resource to be exploited in service to the Imperium's survival. Inquisitorial involvement represents a dramatic escalation in the response to tithe failure, occurring when the administratum suspects heresy, corruption, or Xeno's influence rather than simple incompetence. An inquisitor investigating an Agri-World's production shortfalls brings resources and authority far beyond normal administratum auditors, including the power to execute suspects without trial, seize assets without compensation, and declare entire populations tainted beyond redemption. The Inquisition approaches such investigations assuming guilt until proven otherwise, viewing tithe failure as a potential symptom of deeper corruption that threatens imperial stability. Planetary governors facing inquisitorial investigation understand that their lives hang by threads, dependent on convincing paranoid, heavily armed zealots that their failures stemmed from mundane problems rather than heretical conspiracy. Exterminatus, the ultimate sanction for worlds deemed irredeemably non-compliant or corrupted beyond salvation, has been declared against Agri-Worlds, whose tithe failures revealed fundamental betrayal of the Imperium. The decision to destroy an entire world and its population does not come lightly even by the grim standards of imperial justice, as it represents the permanent loss of agricultural production capacity that might feed billions. However, the Inquisition and high-ranking administratum officials recognize that tolerating serious non-compliance creates precedents that could encourage other worlds to resist their tithe obligations. An agri-world revealed to be trading with Xenos, harboring heretical cults that sabotaged production or deliberately withholding food to gain political leverage faces destruction, as an example to others who might consider similar betrayals. The economic pressure created by the tithe system forces agri-worlds to operate at production levels that leave minimal safety margins for unexpected problems. Governors must balance meeting current tithe demands against maintaining enough reserves to sustain their own populations if harvests fail or shipping delays prevent food imports. This calculation becomes particularly fraught because agri-worlds, despite producing vast quantities of food, often cannot feed themselves entirely from local production. Specialization means that a grain world might produce millions of tons of wheat, but lack the infrastructure to grow vegetables, fruits, or protein sources necessary for balanced nutrition. These worlds depend on trade with other agricultural planets or imports from off-world to provide dietary variety for their populations, creating circular dependencies where food-producing worlds themselves require food imports. The social structure of agri-worlds reflects the fundamental inequality that characterizes imperial society, amplified by the specific demands of agricultural production operating at planetary scales. At the apex of this hierarchy stand the planetary governors, individuals who inherit or receive appointment to positions granting absolute authority over billions of lives and the agricultural output that feeds entire sectors. These governors typically emerge from noble houses whose control over vast estates stretches back centuries or millennia, families that accumulated power during the world's initial settlement or received land grants from the administratum in recognition of service to the Imperium. A governor's palace might occupy hundreds of square kilometers, surrounded by gardens that showcase exotic plants imported from across the galaxy at costs that could feed thousands of workers for years. The noble houses controlling agri-world estates operate as feudal lords in all but name, their authority over their territories limited only by the need to meet tithe obligations and avoid attracting unwanted attention from imperial authorities. These families maintain private armies of household troops, employ thousands of administrative staff to manage their holdings, and live in luxury that stands in stark contrast to the conditions endured by the workers toiling in their fields. Succession within noble houses follows complex rules of inheritance that blend local tradition with imperial law, creating situations where distant relatives, illegitimate children, or ambitious spouses engage in elaborate political maneuvering to secure control of profitable estates. The administratum cares nothing for these internal power struggles, provided they do not disrupt agricultural production or tithe collection. Estate management on this scale requires sophisticated administrative apparatuses that coordinate planting schedules, harvest operations, equipment maintenance, worker assignments, and the processing of raw crops into forms suitable for tithe shipment. The administrative classes that handle these responsibilities occupy a middle position in agri-world society, elevated above common laborers but subordinate to the nobility they serve. Senior administrators might oversee operations spanning entire continents, managing sub-administrators who in turn direct local overseers responsible for specific agricultural zones. These positions often pass through families as well, creating dynasties of administrators whose expertise in managing agricultural logistics becomes hereditary knowledge refined over generations. The Administratum maintains its own presence on Agri-Worlds through Adeptus Terra representatives who monitor production, verify tithe calculations, and ensure compliance with imperial regulations. These officials operate independently of planetary governors, answering to distant superiors in the segmentum bureaucracy rather than local authority. Their compounds exist as isolated enclaves of imperial power, fortified positions where adepts maintain records, conduct audits, and communicate with off-world authorities through astropathic relay. Planetary governors must maintain cordial relations with these Administratum representatives, while recognizing that these same officials possess the authority to report non-compliance that could result in the governor's removal or worse. The massive serf populations performing the actual agricultural labor constitute the overwhelming majority of inhabitants on most agri-worlds, billions of workers whose lives consist of endless toil in service to the emperor and the noble houses that control their existence. These populations exist in conditions that range from barely tolerable to actively horrific, depending on local management practices, available resources, and the degree of mechanization present on the world. Workers typically receive housing in sprawling settlements near the fields they cultivate, structures built from local materials that provide minimal protection from weather and no comfort beyond basic shelter. Families crowd into single-room dwellings, multiple generations sharing spaces designed for functionality rather than dignity. The distinction between mechanized agri-worlds and labor-intensive agricultural planets creates vastly different population dynamics and social conditions. Highly mechanized worlds employ sophisticated farming equipment inherited from the dark age of technology or manufactured by forge worlds to Mechanicus specifications. Massive harvester machines the size of Imperial Guard tanks crawl across endless grain fields, operated by crews who spend weeks at a time living inside these mobile platforms. Automated irrigation systems respond to moisture sensors scattered across thousands of square kilometers. Processing facilities employ conveyor systems and sorting machinery that require minimal human oversight. These worlds maintain relatively small populations measured in millions rather than billions, with workers serving primarily as machine operators, maintenance technicians, and supervisors coordinating automated systems. The social structure on mechanized agri-worlds reflects the technical skills required to operate complex equipment. Machine operators enjoy elevated status compared to manual laborers, receiving better housing, superior rations, and privileges that acknowledge their specialized knowledge. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains permanent missions on heavily mechanized agricultural worlds, tech priests who oversee the maintenance of sacred machinery and train operators in the proper rituals required to appease machine spirits. These Mechanicus representatives exercise significant influence over planetary operations, as governors recognize that agricultural production depends entirely on keeping machinery functional. A single critical equipment failure might halt harvests across entire continental regions, creating production shortfalls that threaten tithe compliance. Labor-intensive agri-worlds present a completely different reality, planets where billions of workers perform agricultural tasks using tools and techniques that would be recognizable to farmers from ancient Terra. These worlds might lack the industrial base necessary to produce or maintain sophisticated machinery, or their environmental conditions might make mechanization impractical. Soil compositions that damage equipment, climate patterns that corrode metal, or simply the economic calculation that human labor costs less than importing and maintaining machinery from distant forge worlds all contribute to the persistence of manual agriculture. Workers on these planets use hand tools to plant seeds, harvest crops by hand, and transport their yields using animal-drawn carts or their own backs. The populations on labor-intensive worlds live in conditions of grinding poverty that the Imperium accepts as necessary for maintaining agricultural production at costs that allow for profitable tithe extraction. Workers receive minimal compensation for their labor, typically paid in food rations, basic clothing, and access to communal housing rather than currency that might allow them to improve their circumstances. Families work together in the fields, with children joining agricultural labor as soon as they possess the physical capability to contribute. Education remains minimal or non-existent, as literacy provides no advantage for workers whose entire existence revolves around planting and harvesting. Life expectancy on these worlds averages significantly below imperial standards, with workers literally worked to death and replaced by the next generation born into the same servitude. The Adeptus Arbites maintains garrison forces on major Agri-Worlds specifically to suppress the labor unrest and tithe riots that periodically erupt when populations reach breaking points. The Arbites approach law enforcement with the same brutal efficiency they employ throughout the Imperium, viewing populations as potential threats to order that require constant surveillance and immediate violent suppression of any resistance. Their fortresses occupy strategic positions near major population centers, heavily armed compounds from which Arbites patrols deploy to monitor worker settlements and agricultural facilities. These enforcers wear heavy carapace armor and carry shotguns, shock mauls, and other weapons designed for crowd control and close-quarters combat against unaugmented humans. Labor uprisings on Agri-Worlds typically begin with workers protesting conditions that have become intolerable even by the grim standards of imperial agricultural servitude. Ration reductions, increased work quotas, or the implementation of particularly harsh new policies by planetary governors or estate administrators can trigger unrest that spreads rapidly through worker populations. These protests start as work stoppages or demands for improved conditions, but the Imperium's response leaves no room for negotiation or compromise. The Arbites deploy immediately upon receiving reports of labor action, surrounding protesting workers and demanding immediate return to assigned duties. Refusal results in lethal force applied without warning or hesitation. Tithe riots represent more serious threats to planetary stability, occurring when populations realize that current production demands will result in local starvation as food gets shipped off-world while workers face insufficient rations. These riots involve desperate populations attempting to seize stored food or prevent tithe shipments from leaving the planet, actions that the Imperium classifies as rebellion against lawful authority. The Arbites' response to tithe riots escalates beyond simple crowd dispersal to full military operations, with enforcers supported by planetary defense forces conducting systematic suppression of resistance. Ringleaders face public execution, participants receive sentences of penal servitude, and entire communities might suffer collective punishment designed to discourage future resistance. The cultural practices that develop on Agri-Worlds blend ancient agricultural traditions with the imperial creed, creating unique expressions of faith that center on the cycles of planting and harvest. Harvest festivals represent the most significant celebrations on agricultural worlds, events that combine religious observance with rare opportunities for workers to enjoy respite from constant labor. The Adeptus Ministorum carefully controls these festivals, ensuring they reinforce proper imperial theology rather than preserving pre-imperial traditions that might harbor heretical elements. Ecclesiarchy preachers deliver sermons praising the emperor as the ultimate provider, blessing the harvest as evidence of his divine favor and warning that future abundance depends on continued faithful service. These festivals incorporate rituals that acknowledge the agricultural cycle while framing it within imperial religious context. Workers offer the first fruits of harvests at shrines, dedicated to the emperor, symbolic gestures that the Ministorum interprets as recognition that all production ultimately belongs to him. Processions carry icons depicting the emperor as a divine farmer or showing saints associated with agriculture, performing miraculous acts of cultivation. Local variations develop based on specific crops or regional traditions, but ecclesiarchy oversight ensures these variations remain within acceptable theological boundaries. The festivals serve multiple purposes beyond religious observance, providing psychological relief that helps maintain worker morale and reinforcing social hierarchies, as nobles and administrators preside over celebrations while maintaining their elevated positions. Seasonal migration patterns characterize life on many agri-worlds, with massive populations moving across continents following planting and harvest schedules. These migrations involve millions of workers traveling hundreds or thousands of kilometers to reach agricultural zones where their labor is required for specific seasonal operations. The logistics of moving such populations strain planetary infrastructure, with roads clogged by endless columns of workers traveling on foot, packed into cargo haulers, or riding in overcrowded rail cars. Temporary settlements spring up near active agricultural zones, sprawling encampments where workers live in basic shelters during planting or harvest seasons before moving to the next location. The Administratum views these migrations as necessary inefficiencies in agricultural production, accepting the lost productivity during transit as unavoidable given the scale of operations and the distribution of arable land across planetary surfaces. Planetary governors coordinate migration schedules with harvest timing, attempting to ensure workers arrive when needed, while minimizing the period between completing work in one zone and beginning in another. The migrations themselves present opportunities for unrest, as large populations moving between locations prove difficult to monitor and control. The Arbites maintains mobile enforcement units that patrol migration routes, watching for signs of organization or resistance that might indicate brewing rebellion. The veneration of local saints associated with fertility and abundance represents another distinctive element of agri-world religious culture, as populations develop particular devotion to figures whose legends emphasize agricultural miracles or divine intervention that saved harvests. The ecclesiarchy officially recognizes certain saints, whose cults prove widespread across multiple agricultural worlds, figures like Saint Aspera, whose prayers supposedly ended a decades-long drought, or Saint Geryon, whose blessing purportedly protected crops from a plague that devastated neighboring worlds. Local saints receive more ambiguous recognition, with the Ministorum tolerating their veneration, provided the associated practices remain within acceptable theological boundaries and do not supersede proper worship of the emperor. Shrines to agricultural saints dot the landscapes of agri-worlds, simple structures built by workers from local materials and decorated with offerings of crops or handmade icons. Workers pray at these shrines before planting begins, seeking divine favor for successful harvests. Families name children after saints associated with particularly successful growing seasons, creating naming patterns that reflect agricultural cycles. The Ministorum monitors these practices carefully, aware that excessive focus on saints rather than the emperor himself represents potential theological deviation that could slide toward heresy. Preachers regularly remind populations that saints serve merely as intercessors whose power derives entirely from the emperor, not as independent sources of divine favor. The contrast between the lives of nobles and workers on agri-worlds creates social tensions that the Imperium manages through a combination of religious indoctrination, brutal enforcement, and the calculated provision of just enough benefits to prevent constant rebellion. Workers receive assurances that their suffering serves the emperor's will, that their labor feeds his armies and sustains his realm. The Ministorum emphasizes that accepting one's station represents proper faith, while attempting to rise above assigned position constitutes sinful pride. This theological framework justifies inequality as divinely ordained, transforming what might otherwise be recognized as exploitation into sacred duty that workers should embrace rather than resist. The standard template construct systems that survived the age of strife represent the pinnacle of agricultural technology available to the Imperium, devices and machines whose principles of operation remain only partially understood even by the tech priests tasked with their maintenance. These SDC fragments contain manufacturing instructions and operational protocols for equipment that can transform marginal agricultural worlds into productive breadbaskets, though complete SDC databases remain vanishingly rare. Most agri-worlds possess only degraded copies of copies, partial datasets that provide enough information to produce functional equipment, without revealing the underlying scientific principles that made such technology possible during humanity's golden age. Automated harvesters built from STC templates dwarf any conventional vehicle, machines that stand 30 meters tall and stretch 100 meters in length. These harvesters process entire fields in single passes, their forward sections equipped with rotating blades that cut crops at optimal heights, while internal mechanisms separate grain from chaff, compress stalks into dense bales for later processing, and deposit waste material in organized rows for collection. The largest harvesters employ crews of 20 or more workers who spend weeks living inside the machines during harvest seasons, maintaining systems, monitoring output quality, and performing the rituals required to keep machine spirits content. These crews develop intense bonds with their assigned harvesters, learning the particular quirks and temperaments of individual machines through years of service. The machine spirits inhabiting these ancient harvesters demand careful propitiation, as the Mechanicus teaches that all technology contains fragments of consciousness that respond to proper respect and grow recalcitrant when neglected. Operators learn specific prayer sequences that must be recited before activating primary systems, oil applications that serve both mechanical and ritual purposes, and the correct incense blends that please particular machine types. A harvester's machine spirit might refuse to start if operators skip morning prayers, develop mechanical problems when crews fail to maintain proper reverence, or perform beyond normal specifications when particularly satisfied with its treatment. The Mechanicus insists these phenomena reflect genuine spiritual presence rather than mere superstition, and experienced operators universally acknowledge that machines respond to proper ritual observance. Gene-modified crop strains represent another crucial STC legacy, plant varieties engineered during the dark age of technology to produce maximum yields in specific environmental conditions. These crops incorporate genetic alterations that increase growth rates, enhance resistance to pests and diseases, improve nutritional content, and allow cultivation in soil compositions that would kill unmodified earth plants. The Biologist division of the Adeptus Mechanicus maintains seed repositories on major forge worlds, carefully preserved genetic material that gets distributed to Agri-Worlds based on their specific environmental characteristics and production requirements. A grain world might receive wheat variants engineered to thrive in low moisture conditions, while tropical agricultural planets get fruit-bearing plants modified to resist fungal infections common in humid environments. The Mechanicus approaches crop genetic modification with characteristic caution, recognizing that alterations to fundamental biological structures risk creating unforeseen problems that might devastate entire planetary harvests. New crop strains undergo decades of testing in controlled environments before receiving approval for widespread cultivation. Tech priests monitor growth patterns, analyze nutritional content, test resistance to various environmental stresses, and verify that modified plants remain stable across multiple generations without developing dangerous mutations. Even approved strains require constant monitoring, as the biologist understands that genetic modifications can drift over time, potentially creating variants that no longer meet original specifications or develop characteristics that threaten other crops. Orbital weather control satellites demonstrate the Imperium's capacity to manipulate planetary environments on massive scales, though such technology exists only on the most developed Agri-Worlds, where the Mechanicus judges the investment worthwhile. These satellites occupy geostationary positions above key agricultural zones, their systems capable of influencing atmospheric conditions across thousands of square kilometers. Weather control operates through multiple mechanisms, including cloud seeding that triggers precipitation in drought-affected regions, atmospheric ionization that disperses dangerous storm systems before they damage crops, and thermal manipulation that extends growing seasons by maintaining optimal temperatures during periods that would normally prove too cold for cultivation. The tech priests operating weather control systems work from ground stations filled with monitoring equipment that displays atmospheric data collected from orbital sensors. These operators track weather patterns developing across entire hemispheres, identifying potential threats to agricultural production and implementing countermeasures that redirect storms, break up hail-producing clouds, or generate rainfall where irrigation systems prove insufficient. The technology requires constant adjustment and careful calibration, as atmospheric systems prove enormously complex and intervention in one region creates cascading effects elsewhere. Operators learn through experience how their world's particular atmospheric patterns respond to manipulation, developing intuitive understanding that supplements the technical knowledge contained in Mechanicus training protocols. Weather control capabilities remain imperfect despite their impressive scope, limited by power requirements, satellite positioning, and the fundamental unpredictability of atmospheric dynamics. Satellites require massive energy inputs to affect weather across significant areas, power that must be generated planetside and transmitted to orbital platforms through methods that themselves demand substantial infrastructure investment. The number of satellites a world can support depends on available resources and Mechanicus technical support, with most agricultural planets possessing at most a handful of platforms covering only their most productive regions. Unexpected weather phenomena still occur despite control efforts, as atmospheric systems occasionally develop patterns that resist manipulation or respond to intervention in counterintuitive ways that worsen rather than improve conditions. Soil regeneration systems address the fundamental problem facing all intensive agriculture. Continuous crop production depletes soil of essential nutrients that must be replaced to maintain yields. SDC-derived regeneration technology approaches this challenge through multiple complementary methods rather than relying on single solutions. Automated fertilizer distribution networks span entire continents, underground pipelines that deliver nutrient compounds directly to root zones of growing crops. These systems monitor soil composition through sensor arrays that measure nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, and trace mineral levels, adjusting fertilizer mixtures to address specific deficiencies in different agricultural zones. The fertilizer itself gets produced in massive chemical plants that transform raw materials into compounds plants can absorb, facilities that operate continuously throughout growing seasons to meet demand measured in millions of tons annually. Bacterial soil treatment represents a biological approach to regeneration, utilizing engineered microorganisms that colonize agricultural soil and perform specific beneficial functions. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria convert atmospheric nitrogen into forms that plants can utilize, reducing dependence on chemical fertilizer inputs. Other bacterial strains break down crop waste and organic matter into nutrients that enrich soil, accelerating natural decomposition processes that would otherwise take years. The biologist carefully controls which bacterial strains receive approval for agricultural use, aware that introducing organisms into planetary ecosystems carries risks of unintended consequences if bacteria spread beyond intended areas or develop characteristics that threaten native species. Crop rotation protocols embedded in SDC agricultural databases provide guidance for maintaining soil health through systematic variation of planted species. These protocols specify which crops should follow others in specific soil types, taking advantage of how different plants utilize and replenish various nutrients. Legumes that fix nitrogen get planted in fields depleted by grain crops, while root vegetables that break up compacted soil follow shallow-rooted plants. The rotation schedules span years or decades, requiring agricultural planners to maintain detailed records of what grew where and coordinate planting across vast areas to implement proper sequences. Planetary governors who ignore rotation protocols in pursuit of short-term production increases inevitably face soil degradation that reduces long-term yields, creating problems that can take generations to correct. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains permanent missions on Agri-Worlds possessing significant quantities of SDC-derived equipment, tech priest enclaves whose members serve as custodians of irreplaceable machinery. These missions occupy fortress monasteries built to Mechanicus specifications, structures that combine workshops, storage facilities for critical components, and shrines dedicated to the Omnissiah. The tech priests assigned to agricultural worlds often come from forge worlds that specialize in biological and chemical technologies, rather than weapons manufacturing or starship construction. Individuals whose training emphasized understanding organic systems and the machines that interact with them. They view their service on Agri-Worlds as sacred duty, maintaining equipment that feeds the Imperium and preserves knowledge that might otherwise be lost. The blessing of agricultural machinery by tech priests transforms routine maintenance into religious ceremony, rituals that acknowledge the sacred nature of technology and the machine spirits that inhabit it. Before harvest seasons begin, tech priests conduct elaborate blessing ceremonies that involve anointing harvesters with sacred oils, burning incense that pleases machine spirits, and reciting lengthy prayers in binary cant that operators cannot understand but must witness with proper reverence. These blessings serve practical purposes beyond spiritual comfort, as the tech priests use the ceremonies to conduct thorough inspections of critical systems, identify potential mechanical problems before equipment enters active service, and perform preventative maintenance disguised as ritual observance. The tech priests jealously guard their knowledge of how agricultural machinery actually functions, revealing only the minimum information necessary for operators to perform basic tasks. Detailed understanding of mechanical principles, the ability to diagnose complex problems, and the knowledge required to fabricate replacement components remain Mechanicus secrets that operators must not possess. This information control serves multiple purposes within Mechanicus doctrine. It maintains the tech priests' monopoly on technical knowledge and reinforces their authority over technological matters. It prevents untrained individuals from attempting repairs that might damage equipment beyond recovery. It ensures that operators approach machinery with proper reverence rather than viewing it as mere tools subject to human understanding and control. Worlds with degraded technology or feudal governance structures present stark contrasts to mechanized agricultural operations, planets where the Imperium's technological capabilities have regressed to levels that would be familiar to farmers from ancient Terra. These worlds lost access to advanced equipment during the Age of Strife and never regained it, or they exist so far from major forge worlds that importing machinery proves economically impractical given their limited production value. The Administratum designates such planets as Agri-Worlds despite their primitive methods, because their populations and available land still allow for significant food production, even if yields per worker fall far below mechanized standards. Animal-drawn plows represent the primary cultivation technology on these primitive agricultural worlds, wooden or metal implements pulled by beasts of burden that break soil in preparation for planting. The animals themselves might be descended from Earth species brought during initial colonization or native creatures domesticated by human settlers over centuries of isolation. Workers guide plows through fields in endless rows, their progress measured in meters per hour rather than the kilometers covered by mechanized equipment. The physical demands of this work exceed anything required on mechanized worlds, as workers must control animals, maintain straight furrows, and repeat the process across vast areas that might take weeks or months to fully prepare for planting. Manual harvesting by billions of workers creates spectacles of human labor operating at scales that dwarf any mechanized operation despite lower efficiency. During harvest seasons on primitive agri-worlds, entire populations mobilize to gather crops before they spoil in fields. Workers move through grain fields with hand scythes, cutting stalks and bundling them for transport to processing areas. Fruit and vegetable harvests require even more intensive labor, as workers must identify ripe produce, carefully remove it to prevent damage, and carry it to collection points. The harvest becomes a race against time and weather, with workers laboring from dawn until darkness falls and sometimes continuing through nights when moons provide sufficient illumination. The social organization required to coordinate manual harvesting across planetary scales creates hierarchies of overseers, supervisors, and labor coordinators who manage worker assignments and monitor progress. These individuals rarely perform physical labor themselves. instead moving through fields on horseback or in animal-drawn carts, shouting instructions and enforcing discipline through physical punishment when workers fail to meet pace requirements. The overseers answer to estate managers, who coordinate operations across multiple agricultural zones, who in turn report to noble landowners or administratum officials monitoring overall production. This layered management structure creates opportunities for corruption and abuse, as each level extracts benefits from those below while providing minimal oversight of how subordinates treat workers. Primitive agricultural methods result in casualty rates from workplace injuries and exhaustion that the Imperium accepts as inevitable costs of production. Workers suffer cuts from hand tools, crushing injuries from falling loads or panicked animals, and deaths from heat exhaustion during harvest seasons when labor demands prevent adequate rest. Medical care remains minimal or non-existent in worker settlements, with injuries that would receive treatment on more developed worlds, instead resulting in permanent disability or death. The administratum tracks these casualties only insofar as they affect total labor availability, calculating whether current death rates threaten production capacity and require population increases through immigration or breeding programs. Specialized production techniques supplement conventional agriculture on worlds where environmental conditions or strategic requirements demand alternative approaches to food generation. Vat-grown protein synthesis represents the most widespread specialized technique, industrial processes that transform basic organic materials into edible protein through chemical and biological manipulation. Massive facilities dedicated to protein synthesis occupy industrial zones on Agri-Worlds and Hive worlds alike, their vats containing nutrient solutions where engineered bacteria or fungal cultures grow rapidly and get harvested continuously. The resulting protein gets processed into paste or dried into blocks, food that provides necessary nutrition despite tasting uniformly unpleasant regardless of processing attempts to improve palatability. The Biologists Division sanctions specific bacterial and fungal strains for protein synthesis after extensive testing confirms they produce safe, nutritionally adequate results without generating toxic byproducts. These approved organisms grow in controlled environments where temperature, nutrient levels, and contamination risks receive constant monitoring. Workers in synthesis facilities wear sealed environment suits and follow strict protocols designed to prevent contamination that might introduce dangerous organisms into production vats. Despite these precautions, contamination incidents occur periodically, requiring facilities to purge entire production runs and sterilize equipment before resuming operations. The economic losses from such incidents pale compared to the potential consequences of distributing contaminated protein that might sicken or kill consumers across multiple worlds. Accelerated growth hormones sanctioned by the Biologists allow agricultural worlds to increase production beyond natural biological limits, chemical compounds that dramatically reduce the time required for crops and livestock to reach harvestable maturity. Plants treated with growth hormones complete their life cycles in fractions of normal timeframes, allowing multiple harvests per standard year, where conventional agriculture would produce only one. Livestock raised with hormone supplementation reach slaughter weight in months rather than years, increasing meat production efficiency substantially. The Mechanicus carefully regulates hormone use, providing specific compounds approved for particular species and prohibiting experimentation with unauthorized variants that might produce dangerous mutations or create health problems in consumers. The long-term effects of consuming hormone-treated food remain subjects of ongoing biologist study, though the Imperium's desperate need for increased production overrides concerns about potential health consequences that might manifest over decades or generations. Workers and soldiers consuming such food rarely live long enough for subtle health effects to become apparent, and the administratum considers population-level health impacts acceptable trade-offs for increased food availability. Some Forge worlds refuse to accept hormone-treated products for their populations, demanding natural growth food despite higher costs, while hive worlds and military supply chains consume treated products without concern for anything beyond immediate nutritional adequacy. Hydroponic facilities in controlled environments allow food production in locations where conventional agriculture proves impossible. Installations that grow crops without soil using nutrient solutions delivered directly to plant roots. These facilities exist on worlds with toxic atmospheres, space stations, void ships on extended deployments, and underground installations where surface conditions prevent normal farming. The technology requires substantial initial investment in construction and equipment, but provides reliable production independent of weather, seasons, or soil quality. Hydroponic crops grow in stacked layers within climate-controlled chambers, maximizing production per square meter of facility space through vertical arrangement impossible in conventional field agriculture. The Mechanicus maintains detailed SDC fragments describing hydroponic system construction and operation, though implementing these designs requires technical expertise and resources beyond what most agricultural worlds can muster. Tech priests oversee major hydroponic installations, monitoring nutrient solution compositions, adjusting environmental controls, and maintaining the pumps and filtration systems that keep solutions circulating. The crops produced through hydroponics typically focus on high-value vegetables and fruits that justify the operational costs, while bulk calorie production remains the domain of conventional field agriculture, where land availability and labor costs favor traditional methods despite lower efficiency per unit area. The strategic calculus of imperial warfare recognizes that armies march on their stomachs, a truth that elevates Agri-Worlds from mere production centers to critical strategic assets whose capture or destruction can determine the outcomes of campaigns spanning decades. Military planners within the Adeptus Munitorum maintain detailed assessments of agricultural production throughout every sector, identifying which Agri-Worlds supply which hive worlds, forge worlds, and military installations. These supply chain maps reveal vulnerabilities that enemy forces can exploit, creating situations where conquering a single agricultural planet might starve a dozen dependent worlds into submission without firing a shot at their defenses. The Imperial Navy's strategic reserve doctrines specifically account for protecting agri-worlds along critical supply routes, recognizing that losing these planets to enemy action creates cascading logistical failures that can cripple entire crusades. The vulnerability of agri-worlds to military action stems from their fundamental nature as production facilities rather than fortress worlds. Planetary defense forces on agricultural planets typically consist of poorly equipped militias whose primary experience involves suppressing labor unrest rather than repelling organized military invasions. A typical agri-world PDF might field a few regiments of infantry armed with las guns and supported by light vehicles, adequate for maintaining order among civilian populations, but hopelessly outmatched against professional military forces. The Adeptus Munitorum assigns minimal military resources to agricultural worlds during peacetime, reasoning that equipment and trained personnel serve better purposes on fortress worlds or active battlefronts. This calculated neglect leaves agri-worlds dependent on orbital defenses and the hope that Imperial Navy patrols will detect and intercept threats before they reach planetary surfaces. Orbital defense platforms represent the primary military infrastructure, protecting valuable agri-worlds from invasion. Weapon stations positioned in high orbit that can engage approaching hostile vessels before they achieve positions for planetary bombardment or troop deployment. These platforms vary enormously in capability, depending on the strategic importance the Administratum assigns to specific worlds. Major agricultural planets supplying multiple hive worlds or positioned along critical supply routes might possess defense networks featuring dozens of platforms equipped with lance batteries, macro cannons, and torpedo tubes capable of threatening all but the largest enemy warships. Lesser agri-worlds make do with minimal orbital defenses, perhaps a handful of weapons platforms with outdated targeting systems and limited ammunition reserves, sufficient to deter pirates or minor Xenos raiders, but inadequate against determined military assault. The effectiveness of orbital defenses depends entirely on early warning systems that detect approaching threats with enough advance notice for platforms to achieve firing solutions and coordinate defensive responses. Augur arrays scattered throughout systems monitor the void for unauthorized warp translations, unusual energy signatures, or the electromagnetic emissions characteristic of starship drives. These detection networks feed data to command centers staffed by naval officers or PDF personnel trained in void warfare coordination. The time between detecting an approaching threat and enemy vessels entering weapons range might span hours or days depending on translation points and approach vectors, periods during which defenders must assess threat levels, request reinforcements from nearby naval assets, and prepare planetary populations for potential invasion. The Gothic War demonstrated with brutal clarity how control over agricultural production could serve as a weapon more devastating than any bombardment cannon. Abaddon the Despoiler's forces specifically targeted Agri-Worlds throughout the Gothic sector, recognizing that destroying or capturing these planets would starve Imperial defenders on Fortress worlds and Hive worlds that depended on their output. Chaos Raiders descended on agricultural planets with systematic efficiency, their attacks following patterns that suggested detailed intelligence regarding which worlds supplied which Imperial installations. Some Agri-Worlds suffered complete destruction through orbital bombardment or virus bombing, their agricultural capacity eliminated permanently as enemy forces denied the Imperium resources they could not claim for themselves. Other planets faced invasion and occupation, their production redirected toward feeding Chaos forces, or simply held to deny the Imperium access to desperately needed food supplies. The starvation tactics employed during the Gothic War created humanitarian catastrophes across multiple systems, as Hive worlds and military installations exhausted their food reserves while awaiting resupply from Agri-Worlds no longer capable of providing it. Hive world populations accustomed to regular food shipments faced rationing that reduced daily caloric intake below subsistence levels, creating conditions where millions died from malnutrition and the diseases that flourish among weakened populations. Military garrisons maintained on emergency rations designed for short-term use found themselves subsisting on inadequate nutrition for months or years, degrading combat effectiveness as soldiers weakened from hunger. The Adeptus Munitorum attempted to reroute supplies from unaffected Agri-Worlds, but the distances involved and the disruption of established shipping routes meant that relief often arrived too late or in insufficient quantities to prevent catastrophic losses. Imperial commanders learned harsh lessons about agricultural vulnerability during the Gothic War, lessons that influenced strategic planning throughout subsequent campaigns. The Segmentum Obscurus Fleet Command implemented new protocols requiring increased naval presence in systems containing critical Agri-Worlds, accepting the strategic cost of diverting warships from offensive operations to protect supply lines. The Administratum accelerated construction of additional orbital defense platforms around major agricultural planets, though the bureaucratic delays inherent in Imperial construction projects meant many of these defenses remained incomplete when the next crisis emerged. Planetary governors on Agri-Worlds received authorization to expand PDF forces and improve defensive fortifications, though the resources allocated for these improvements rarely matched the scope of the threats they were meant to counter. The Tyranid Hive fleet's present threats to Agri-Worlds that transcend conventional military conquest, Xenos organisms that consume entire planetary biospheres in pursuit of biomass to fuel their reproduction and expansion. When Tyranid forces identify an Agri-World, they recognize it as a target-rich environment where the very characteristics that make planets valuable to the Imperium also make them ideal feeding grounds for the Hive mind's endless hunger. The initial stages of Tyranid invasion see mycetic spores raining down across agricultural zones, each spore-containing organisms specifically adapted for rapid consumption of plant matter and any animal life they encounter. Hormagaunts and termagants swarm through fields in numbers that darken horizons, their feeding frenzies consuming crops, livestock, and human workers with equal efficiency. The consumption process employed by tyrannid forces operates with biological efficiency that horrifies observers who witness it. Ripper swarms carpet agricultural land in living tides of teeth and digestive acids, breaking down organic matter into base components that larger tyrannid organisms collect and transport to digestion pools. These pools, created by biovores and other specialized organisms, dissolve collected biomass into nutrient slurry that feeds the capillary towers rising across conquered territory. The towers themselves represent the visible manifestation of tyrannid planetary consumption, organic structures that extend tendrils deep into planetary crusts while reaching toward orbit, eventually creating atmospheric conditions that allow hive ships to directly siphon processed biomass from planetary surfaces. An agri-world subjected to complete tyrannid consumption becomes a lifeless rock stripped of all organic material, its soil reduced to sterile dust, and its atmosphere transformed into toxic gases that serve no purpose for human life. Defending agri-worlds against tyrannid invasion requires military responses that differ fundamentally from conventional warfare against human or other Xenos forces. The hive mind does not negotiate, retreat based on casualties, or maintain supply lines that can be disrupted. Every tyrannid organism destroyed represents negligible loss to the hive fleet, as their biomass gets reclaimed and recycled into new warriors. Imperial defenders must achieve total extermination of tyrannid presence, or accept that any surviving organisms will continue consuming planetary resources until nothing remains. The Astra Militarum deploys specialized anti-tyrannid regiments to threatened agri-worlds when advance warning allows, forces trained in the tactics necessary for combating endless swarms of Xenos creatures. These regiments establish defensive perimeters around critical infrastructure and population centers, creating kill zones where massed lasgun fire and artillery bombardment can destroy tyrannid organisms as they advance in their characteristic wave attacks. The decision to defend or abandon threatened agri-worlds involves brutal calculations that weigh the strategic value of agricultural production against the military resources required for successful defense. Imperial commanders facing tyrannid invasions must assess whether available forces possess sufficient strength to repel the Xenos threat, or whether attempting defense will merely result in the destruction of valuable military assets alongside the planetary population. Some agri-worlds receive orders for complete evacuation, their populations loaded onto transport vessels, while remaining military forces conduct delaying actions that buy time for civilians to escape. The food stocks stored on evacuated worlds get destroyed through orbital bombardment or demolition charges, denying the tyrannids biomass while ensuring the hive fleet gains no benefit from capturing the planet. Other agri-worlds deemed strategically critical receive maximum defensive support, with entire regiments of Imperial Guard deploying alongside Space Marine strike forces and naval assets committed to orbital supremacy. Chaos raids targeting agri-worlds pursue objectives that differ from simple resource denial or conquest, as the forces of the ruinous powers seek slave populations for dark purposes that serve their patron gods. The agricultural workers toiling on these planets represent ideal targets for slave raids, populations numbering in the billions with minimal defensive capabilities and limited means of escape. Chaos raiders descend on worker settlements in lightning strikes, their forces overwhelming local PDF resistance and herding terrified civilians into transport vessels. The captured workers face fates that vary depending on which Chaos faction claims them. Cornate warbands drag slaves to blood-soaked arenas, where they die for the entertainment of Chaos Space Marines and the glory of the Blood God. Slaaneshi cultists subject captives to torments designed to generate the suffering and excess that feeds their dark prince. Nurgle worshippers infect slaves with diseases that transform them into plague-ridden vectors, spreading contagion wherever they go. The psychological impact of Chaos raids extends beyond the immediate casualties and captured populations, creating terror that undermines worker morale and productivity across entire sectors. Agri-world populations live with the knowledge that chaos forces might descend at any moment, that their isolation and vulnerability make them prime targets for raiders seeking easy victims. This fear proves well-founded, as chaos warbands specifically target agricultural worlds precisely because their weak defenses and large populations provide maximum return for minimal risk. The Adeptus Arbites and planetary defense forces attempt to maintain order and prevent panic, but their assurances ring hollow when workers can see that defensive capabilities remain inadequate against determined chaos assault. Some planets experience waves of religious fervor as populations seek protection through faith, while others see increased incidents of heresy as desperate workers turn to forbidden powers in hope of salvation that the Imperium seems unable to provide. The Astra Militarum's recruitment from agri-world populations produces regiments that bring specific characteristics shaped by their origins in agricultural labor. These regiments lack the technical sophistication of Forge World recruits or the savage ferocity of Feral World warriors, but they possess qualities that make them valuable assets in prolonged campaigns where endurance and discipline determine outcomes. Workers accustomed to endless agricultural labor transfer those same qualities to military service, demonstrating capacity for sustained physical exertion that exceeds soldiers from more comfortable backgrounds. The mental discipline required to maintain productivity during harvest seasons, despite exhaustion and harsh conditions, translates into military discipline that keeps agri-world regiments functional under circumstances that might break units lacking similar backgrounds. The physical conditioning that agricultural labor provides creates soldiers whose baseline fitness exceeds that of Hive World recruits, though it falls short of the peak conditioning achieved by warriors from Death Worlds or feral planets. Years of manual labor build muscular endurance and cardiovascular capacity that serve well in infantry combat, particularly during campaigns requiring long marches or sustained fighting without adequate rest periods. Agri-world soldiers demonstrate particular aptitude for siege warfare and defensive operations, situations where troops must maintain positions for extended periods while enduring bombardment, limited rations, and constant pressure from enemy forces. Their experience with hardship and deprivation makes them psychologically resilient to conditions that might cause other regiments to break, accepting suffering as simply another aspect of service to the Emperor, no different from the suffering they endured as agricultural workers. The familiarity with harsh labor conditions that agri-world recruits bring to military service manifests in their approach to the unglamorous work that constitutes most military life between battles. These soldiers accept trench digging, fortification construction, and equipment maintenance as natural extensions of their previous existence, rather than degrading tasks beneath their dignity. Officers commanding agri-world regiments report fewer discipline problems related to work assignments compared to regiments drawn from hive worlds or civilized planets where populations lack experience with manual labor. The soldiers simply perform assigned tasks with the same methodical efficiency they applied to agricultural work, viewing military service as fundamentally similar to their previous lives despite the addition of combat operations. The tactical limitations of agri-world regiments stem from the same characteristics that provide their strengths, as populations raised in agricultural labor lack exposure to sophisticated technology or complex tactical thinking. These soldiers require extensive training in equipment maintenance and operation beyond simple las guns, as their backgrounds provide no preparation for handling more advanced weapon systems or vehicles. The tactical flexibility and initiative that characterize elite regiments rarely develop in agri-world units, whose soldiers perform best when following clear orders in straightforward situations, rather than adapting to rapidly changing battlefield conditions. Commanders learn to employ these regiments in roles that leverage their endurance and discipline, while avoiding situations requiring technical expertise or tactical sophistication beyond their training. The strategic importance of maintaining agri-world production creates situations where imperial military forces must balance offensive operations against the need to protect agricultural supply lines. A crusade might possess sufficient strength to push deeper into enemy territory, but doing so risks overextending supply chains and exposing Agri-Worlds to enemy raids that could cripple the entire campaign through starvation. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains elaborate logistics models, attempting to calculate sustainable advance rates that account for supply line security, but these models frequently prove inadequate when confronted with the unpredictable realities of warfare across galactic scales. Commanders face constant pressure to advance more aggressively, while simultaneously receiving reports of threatened Agri-Worlds requiring defensive reinforcement, creating strategic dilemmas where every decision involves accepting unacceptable risks. The Tyranid hive fleets represent an existential threat to Agri-Worlds that operates on a scale beyond conventional military conquest, as these Xenos organisms view agricultural planets not as territory to be held, but as feeding grounds to be consumed in their entirety. When the hive mind's vast consciousness identifies an Agri-World through its network of scout organisms, it recognizes the planet as an optimal target where billions of tons of biomass exist in concentrated, easily accessible forms. The crops covering continental landmasses, the livestock raised in massive herding operations, and the human populations numbering in the billions all represent raw material for the hive fleet's endless reproduction cycle. The speed at which Tyranid forces can strip a planet of all organic matter defies comprehension for those who have not witnessed it, with entire worlds reduced to lifeless rock within solar weeks once the consumption process reaches full efficiency. The initial phases of Tyranid planetary assault focus on establishing beachheads from which the swarm can expand across agricultural zones with maximum efficiency. Mycetic spores rain down from orbit in numbers that overwhelm planetary defense systems designed to intercept conventional drop pods or landing craft. Each spore contains organisms specifically adapted for the consumption of plant matter and soft targets, with hormigants and termagants forming the primary wave that sweeps across farmland like a living tide. These creatures demonstrate horrifying efficiency in their feeding behavior, their scything talons and devourer weapons tearing through crops, while their digestive systems rapidly process consumed biomass. Agricultural workers caught in the open during these initial swarms face death within moments as the creatures overwhelm them through sheer numbers, their bodies becoming additional biomass for the hive fleet's consumption. The Ripper swarms that follow behind the initial assault waves perform the systematic work of planetary consumption, carpeting agricultural land in masses of small organisms whose sole purpose involves breaking down all organic matter into forms that larger Tyranid creatures can transport to digestion pools. These diminutive horrors possess teeth capable of chewing through wood, flesh, and even softer metals, while their digestive acids dissolve tougher materials that their mandibles cannot tear apart directly. A field of grain that took months to grow and represented tons of potential food for Imperial populations gets reduced to digestible slurry within hours as Ripper swarms move across it in coordinated feeding patterns directed by the hive mind's vast intelligence. The soil itself becomes a target for consumption, as the Rippers burrow beneath surfaces to access root systems, and the organic material mixed into earth through years of fertilization and crop rotation. The capillary towers that rise across conquered territory represent the visible manifestation of the hive fleet's consumption infrastructure, organic structures that extend tendrils deep into planetary crust while reaching toward the upper atmosphere. These towers serve as collection and processing points for the biomass harvested by smaller organisms, their internal chambers filled with digestive pools where organic matter gets broken down into base nutrients. The towers themselves grow at rates that seem impossible, constructed from processed biomass and specialized Tyranid organisms that sacrifice themselves to become structural components. Within days of establishing initial beachheads, capillary towers might reach hundreds of meters in height, their grotesque forms dominating landscapes that previously featured only grain silos and processing facilities. The towers pump processed nutrients toward orbit through biological mechanisms that operate like massive circulatory systems, eventually creating atmospheric conditions that allow hive ships to directly siphon resources from planetary surfaces. The consumption of an agri-world by Tyranid forces proceeds through predictable phases that Imperial observers have documented across dozens of worlds that fell to the hive fleets. The initial assault phase lasts between 3 and 7 standard days, as swarm organisms establish control over agricultural zones and begin systematic feeding. The consolidation phase follows as capillary towers rise and digestion pools expand across the planet, a period lasting 2 to 3 weeks during which the hive mind coordinates the transformation of consumed biomass into new warrior organisms and the infrastructure necessary for complete planetary consumption. The final extraction phase sees the hive fleet directly harvesting processed nutrients from orbit, a process that continues until atmospheric composition becomes toxic to all remaining life and soil gets stripped down to bedrock. Agri-worlds subjected to complete Tyranid consumption become dead rocks orbiting their stars, their surfaces scoured of anything organic, and their potential for supporting human life destroyed for millennia or permanently. Imperial military responses to Tyranid threats against agri-worlds must account for the reality that conventional defensive strategies prove inadequate against an enemy that views casualties as irrelevant and possesses no supply lines to disrupt. The Astra Militarum deploys specialized anti-Tyranid forces to threatened agricultural planets when intelligence provides advance warning of approaching hive fleet elements, though the distances involved and the speed of Tyranid advance often mean reinforcements arrive too late or in insufficient strength. These defensive forces establish fortified perimeters around critical infrastructure and population centers, creating kill zones where concentrated fire from lasguns, heavy bolters, and artillery can destroy advancing Tyranid organisms through sheer volume of fire. The defenders understand that they must achieve complete extermination of all Tyranid presence, or accept that any surviving organisms will continue consuming planetary resources until nothing remains worth defending. The decision to commit resources to defending threatened agri-worlds versus evacuating populations and destroying food stocks to deny the enemy biomass represents one of the most agonizing choices Imperial commanders face during Tyranid incursions. Strategists within the Adeptus Munitorum calculate the value of agricultural production against the military assets required for successful defense, weighing whether available forces possess realistic chances of repelling the Xenos threat. Some agri-worlds receive orders for complete evacuation despite their populations numbering in the billions, as commanders determine that attempting defense would merely result in the destruction of valuable military forces alongside civilian casualties. The evacuation of an entire agri-world requires massive transport capacity and time that defenders must buy through delaying actions, with PDF forces and any available Imperial Guard regiments conducting fighting retreats that slow Tyranid advance while civilian populations board transport vessels. The food stocks stored on evacuated agri-worlds represent tempting targets for Tyranid consumption, millions of tons of processed grain and protein supplements concentrated in storage facilities that the hive mind would eagerly absorb. Imperial doctrine requires the complete destruction of these stocks before evacuation completes, denying the enemy biomass while ensuring the hive fleet gains no benefit from capturing the planet. Naval vessels in orbit conduct precision strikes against storage silos using lance batteries, while ground forces plant demolition charges in facilities too dispersed for effective orbital bombardment. The destruction of food that could feed billions, while populations across the Imperium face starvation, creates moral dilemmas that officers must suppress in favor of strategic necessity, as allowing Tyranids to consume those resources would enable the creation of additional warrior organisms that threaten other worlds. Orc invasions of agri-worlds pursue different objectives than Tyranid consumption or human military conquest. as greenskin forces view agricultural planets primarily as sources of loot and opportunities for violence, rather than territory to be systematically exploited. The orcs descend on these worlds in ramshackle spacecraft, cobbled together from scrap metal and salvaged components. Their approach to planetary assault characterized by enthusiasm rather than tactical sophistication. The initial landings see crewed drop pods and landing craft crashing into agricultural zones, with minimal concern for precision or casualties, as orcs view the journey to the surface as simply the beginning of a good fight. The greenskins pour from their vessels, whooping and firing weapons in all directions, their joy at finding new enemies to kill overriding any interest in the crops or infrastructure surrounding them. The degradation of agricultural infrastructure during orc occupation occurs through a combination of deliberate destruction and simple greenskin neglect of anything that does not directly contribute to warfare or violence. Orcs tear apart harvesting equipment to salvage metal for their ramshackle weapons and vehicles, showing no understanding or concern for the sophisticated machinery they destroy in the process. Irrigation systems get broken as orcs drive crude war buggies across farmland without regard for the infrastructure beneath them. Storage facilities become targets for looting as greenskins search for anything they consider valuable, which typically means weapons, ammunition, or materials they can fashion into crude tools. The food stored in these facilities holds no interest for orcs beyond immediate consumption, as greenskin physiology allows them to digest nearly anything organic, and their culture places no value on stockpiling resources for future use. The orc tendency to establish crude settlements wherever they land creates permanent damage to agricultural capacity that persists long after Imperial forces eventually liberate occupied worlds. Greenskin encampments sprawl across former farmland, their structures built from salvaged materials and featuring none of the organization or planning that characterizes human habitation. Orcs dump waste wherever convenient, contaminating soil and water sources with biological and chemical pollutants that render affected areas unsuitable for crop cultivation. The greenskins' fungal reproduction cycle means that orc spores spread across entire regions during occupation, creating ongoing infestation problems that can last for generations after the initial invasion force gets destroyed. These spores eventually grow into new orcs if not systematically purged, creating feral greenskin populations that continue raiding agricultural operations and threatening workers even after organized orc forces withdraw or face defeat. The liberation of Agri-Worlds from orc occupation requires military operations that differ fundamentally from conventional planetary assault, as Imperial forces must not only defeat greenskin armies, but also conduct systematic purges of spore infestations that threaten long-term agricultural viability. The Astra Militarum deploys specialized units trained in anti-orc operations, forces that understand the need for complete extermination rather than simple military defeat. These regiments conduct methodical sweeps through former orc territories, using flamers and phosphex weapons to burn out spore colonies and sterilize contaminated soil. The process takes months or years depending on the scale of infestation and the resources available for purging operations, with agricultural production remaining impossible in affected regions until Imperial forces declare them clear of greenskin contamination. The reversion of liberated Agri-Worlds to feral or feudal status represents a common outcome when orc occupation destroys critical infrastructure beyond the Imperium's capacity or willingness to restore. The Adeptus Mechanicus evaluates damaged agricultural equipment and processing facilities to determine whether repairs prove economically viable compared to the planet's strategic value. Worlds that suffered extensive destruction might lack the sophisticated machinery necessary for efficient food production, forcing populations to rely on manual agricultural methods using primitive tools. The Administratum must then decide whether to invest resources in rebuilding destroyed infrastructure or to reclassify the world at a lower tier that reflects its reduced production capacity. Some liberated Agri-Worlds never recover their previous output levels, their populations struggling to maintain subsistence agriculture while the Imperium redirects resources to more productive planets. Chaos corruption of Agri-Worlds manifests through mechanisms that reflect the particular interests and domains of the ruinous powers, with Nurgle's influence proving especially devastating to agricultural production through the spread of supernatural plagues that affect crops and livestock. The Plague God views agricultural worlds as particularly suitable targets for his gifts, as the concentrated biomass and interconnected nature of farming operations allow diseases to spread with horrifying efficiency. Nurgle-blessed plagues might begin as seemingly natural crop failures or livestock illnesses, their supernatural origins remaining hidden until the infections spread beyond any possibility of containment. These diseases demonstrate characteristics that defy natural biology, with affected plants developing grotesque mutations that transform grain fields into forests of diseased, pus-weeping stalks, while livestock suffer from conditions that keep them alive in states of perpetual decay and suffering. The spread of Nurgle's corruption through agricultural supply chains creates cascading contamination that threatens entire sectors as infected food gets shipped off-world before anyone recognizes the taint. Workers processing diseased crops become vectors for supernatural plagues, their bodies hosting infections that spread to others through contact or simply proximity to the blessed of Nurgle. The storage facilities and transport vessels that handle contaminated food become sources of ongoing infection, their surfaces coated with bacterial films that resist conventional sterilization methods. By the time Imperial authorities recognized the supernatural nature of the outbreak, infected food might have reached dozens of worlds across multiple systems, creating pandemic conditions that overwhelm medical infrastructure and threaten billions with death or transformation into plague-ridden servants of the Plague God. The establishment of dark mechanicum facilities on corrupted Agri-Worlds represents a different manifestation of chaos influence, as heretic tech priests pursue twisted versions of agricultural production that serve the ruinous powers rather than the Imperium. These facilities produce food that appears normal but carries subtle taint that corrupts those who consume it, introducing chaos influence through the most basic human necessity. The Dark Mechanicum approaches food production with the same perverted ingenuity they apply to all technological endeavors, creating processing methods that infuse products with warp energies or biological agents that gradually transform consumers into willing servants of chaos. The tainted food might cause no immediate symptoms, its effects manifesting over months or years as populations slowly succumb to corruption that spreads through communities like invisible plague. The detection of dark mechanicum taint in agricultural products proves enormously difficult, as the heretics specifically design their corrupted food to pass standard imperial purity tests and avoid triggering obvious signs of contamination. Sanctioned psychers might sense wrongness in affected products, but the sheer volume of food moving through imperial supply chains makes comprehensive psychic screening impractical. The taint typically comes to light only after populations consuming corrupted food begin displaying symptoms of chaos worship or mutation, by which point the contamination has spread far beyond any single source. The Inquisition responds to confirmed cases of tainted food distribution with characteristic ruthlessness, declaring entire supply chains suspect and ordering the destruction of food stocks that might feed millions, accepting mass starvation as preferable to allowing chaos corruption to spread through the Imperium's agricultural networks. Environmental catastrophes represent threats to agri-world productivity that require no external enemy, as the intensive agricultural methods necessary to meet imperial tithe demands create conditions where natural disasters can devastate entire planetary harvests. Pestilence outbreaks occur when insect populations or fungal infections that normally exist at manageable levels suddenly explode across agricultural zones, their growth fueled by the monoculture farming that characterizes most agri-worlds. A planet that dedicates millions of square kilometers to growing a single grain variety creates ideal conditions for specialized pests that feed on that specific crop, allowing pest populations to reach numbers that overwhelm natural predators and resistance mechanisms. The insects or fungi spread across continental landmasses in waves that destroy crops faster than workers can harvest or protect them, turning fields that should have produced millions of tons of food into wastelands of dead plants and voracious pests. The imperial response to major pestilence outbreaks typically involves massive application of chemical pesticides produced in quantities that would be toxic to human workers if proper precautions were followed, which they rarely are given the urgency of protecting harvests. Workers spray fields while wearing minimal protective equipment, their exposure to toxic chemicals accepted as necessary sacrifice to save crops from complete loss. The pesticides themselves often prove only partially effective against pests that have adapted to previous chemical treatments, creating evolutionary pressure that produces increasingly resistant populations. Some agri-worlds face recurring cycles of pestilence and chemical treatment that gradually degrade soil quality and poison water sources, creating long-term environmental damage that reduces future agricultural productivity even as it addresses immediate pest problems. Climatic shifts caused by warp storms affecting stellar radiation patterns create environmental conditions that agricultural systems designed for stable weather cannot accommodate, as crops bred for specific temperature ranges and precipitation levels fail when those conditions change unexpectedly. A warp storm that alters the output of a system star by even small percentages can shift growing seasons, change rainfall patterns, or create temperature extremes that kill crops in fields before harvest. The Administratum's agricultural planning assumes relatively stable environmental conditions based on centuries of historical data, leaving no flexibility to adapt when warp phenomena disrupt those assumptions. Planetary governors facing climatic shifts that threaten harvests must choose between attempting to maintain production of crops no longer suited to changed conditions, or implementing wholesale changes to agricultural systems that might take years to complete while tithes remain due. Soil exhaustion from overcultivation represents an insidious threat that develops gradually over decades or centuries as intensive farming depletes nutrients faster than natural processes or artificial fertilization can replenish them. The Administratum's tithe demands create constant pressure to maximize production without regard for long-term sustainability, pushing planetary governors to extract maximum yields from available land regardless of consequences for future productivity. Fields that should lie fallow to recover instead get planted continuously, their soil losing organic content and essential minerals with each harvest cycle. The application of chemical fertilizers masks declining soil quality temporarily, allowing continued production at levels that appear sustainable until the underlying degradation reaches critical thresholds where crops begin failing despite maximum fertilizer application. The recovery of exhausted soil requires reducing or eliminating agricultural production in affected areas for extended periods while implementing soil regeneration programs, a solution that conflicts directly with imperial tithe obligations that allow no reduction in output. Planetary governors facing soil exhaustion must somehow maintain production levels while simultaneously implementing recovery programs, an impossible balance that typically results in expanding cultivation into marginal lands to compensate for declining yields in exhausted areas. This expansion pushes agricultural operations into regions with inferior soil or unfavorable conditions, creating new problems while failing to address the underlying exhaustion of primary agricultural zones. Some agri-worlds enter death spirals where expanding cultivation to maintain tithe compliance accelerates overall soil degradation, gradually reducing the planet's total agricultural capacity despite desperate efforts to maintain production. Water source contamination creates catastrophic threats to agricultural production on worlds where irrigation depends on rivers, lakes, or aquifer systems that become polluted through industrial runoff, waste disposal, or natural contamination events. The concentration of agricultural operations in specific regions creates enormous water demands that stress natural hydrological systems, while the runoff from fertilized fields carries chemicals back into water sources that supply both irrigation and human consumption. Some agri-worlds face situations where the water used for irrigation has become so contaminated with agricultural chemicals that it gradually poisons the soil it irrigates, creating feedback loops where attempts to maintain production through increased fertilization worsen the underlying contamination problem. The purification of contaminated water sources requires infrastructure and technology that many agri-worlds lack, particularly planets classified as secondary agricultural producers, where resources get divided between farming and light industrial operations. The Adeptus Mechanicus can provide water purification systems based on SDC templates, but the cost of implementing such systems across planetary scales exceeds what most agricultural worlds can afford without reducing resources allocated to meeting tithe obligations. Planetary governors must balance immediate production needs against long-term environmental sustainability, a calculation that almost invariably favors short-term output given the immediate consequences of tithe failure versus the gradual nature of environmental degradation. The result sees many agri-worlds operating on trajectories toward environmental collapse that everyone involved recognizes, but feels powerless to prevent given the structural incentives that prioritize current production over future viability. The realm of Ultramar stands as the Imperium's premier example of organized agricultural production operating at maximum efficiency, a collection of 500 worlds that demonstrate what human civilization can achieve when proper administration combines with adequate resources and stable governance. The Ultramarines maintain control over this region of space through methods that differ substantially from typical Imperial governance, implementing systems that balance tithe obligations against long-term sustainability in ways that most planetary governors either cannot or will not attempt. The agri-worlds within Ultramar benefit from this enlightened approach, receiving investment in infrastructure and technology that transforms them into model agricultural producers whose outputs exceed comparable worlds operating under standard Imperial administration. Tarantus occupies a position of particular importance within Ultramar's agricultural network, a temperate world whose continental landmasses feature soil compositions that approach the mythical alpha-grade fertility, rating rarely found outside of carefully terraformed planets. The world's climate operates with predictable seasonal cycles that allow for precise planning of planting and harvest schedules, while rainfall patterns provide adequate moisture without the destructive storms that plague less fortunate agricultural planets. The Ultramarines established Tarantus as an agri-world during the Great Crusade's expansion phase, recognizing its potential for sustained high-yield production that could support the growing populations on Ultramar's hive worlds and forge complexes. The initial settlers brought sophisticated agricultural equipment and crop strains optimized for Tarantus's specific environmental conditions, creating foundations for production systems that have operated continuously for 10,000 years. The agricultural infrastructure on Tarantus reflects Ultramar's emphasis on efficiency and long-term planning rather than the extractive approach that characterizes most Imperial agri-worlds. Massive harvesting machines imported from forge worlds within Ultramar traverse grain fields that stretch beyond visual horizons, their operation coordinated through data networks that optimize routes and minimize wasted time or fuel. The processing facilities that convert raw crops into forms suitable for transport and storage incorporate technologies that preserve nutritional content while extending shelf life beyond what standard Imperial methods achieve. Storage complexes built to withstand siege conditions hold reserves sufficient to sustain Tarantus's own population for years while still meeting tithe obligations, a level of preparedness that most agri-worlds cannot afford given the pressure to ship every possible ton of food off-world. The population of Tarantus lives under conditions that would seem luxurious to workers on typical agricultural worlds, though still harsh by the standards of more developed imperial planets. Workers receive housing in planned communities featuring actual family dwellings rather than communal barracks, structures built from durable materials that provide insulation against weather and space for basic amenities. The Ultramarines enforce labor standards that limit working hours to levels sustainable over decades rather than grinding workers to death through overwork and replacing them with new generations. Medical facilities staffed by trained practitioners provide care that prevents minor injuries from becoming permanent disabilities, maintaining worker health at levels that improve long-term productivity even if they reduce short-term output. Education programs ensure basic literacy among the population, as the Ultramarines recognize that educated workers operate sophisticated equipment more effectively and identify problems before they become critical failures. The integration of Tarantus into Ultramar's broader economic and military networks demonstrates how agricultural worlds can serve purposes beyond simple food production when proper planning and investment occur. The world maintains PDF forces equipped with actual military-grade weapons rather than the obsolete equipment typical of agricultural planet defense forces, units that train regularly and receive support from Ultramarines training cadres who ensure they maintain combat readiness. Orbital defense platforms protecting Tarantus feature modern targeting systems and adequate ammunition reserves, creating defensive capabilities that can delay or repel raids by all but the most determined enemies. The Ultramarines view protecting agricultural production as essential to maintaining Ultramar's overall strength, accepting the resource costs of proper defense as investments in long-term stability rather than wasteful expenditures that reduce short-term profits. Quintarn represents another crucial agri-world within Ultramar's agricultural network, though its characteristics differ substantially from Tarantus's grain-focused production. The world features extensive ocean coverage with relatively small landmasses, creating conditions where aquatic farming operations produce the majority of food output. Massive cultivation platforms float across Quintarn seas, harvesting algae and kelp variants engineered specifically for high protein content and rapid growth rates. The platforms themselves represent sophisticated pieces of infrastructure, incorporating living quarters for workers, processing facilities that convert raw aquatic crops into protein supplements, and the equipment necessary to maintain optimal growing conditions across thousands of square kilometers of ocean surface. The Ultramarines invested heavily in establishing these platforms during Quintarn's initial development, recognizing that the world's limited land area made conventional agriculture impractical, but its vast oceans represented untapped potential for food production. The protein supplements produced on Quintarn supply populations throughout Ultramar with nutritional requirements that grain-based diets alone cannot provide, creating balanced food distribution that maintains population health more effectively than the monotonous rations typical of most imperial worlds. The supplements get processed into forms that remain stable during extended storage and transport, allowing shipment to distant worlds within Ultramar's sphere without spoilage concerns. The taste of Quintarn protein supplements reportedly exceeds the palatability of similar products from other ocean farming worlds, though this represents relative improvement rather than actual culinary achievement. Workers throughout Ultramar consume these supplements as standard components of their rations, accepting the bland flavor as preferable to the nutritional deficiencies that result from diets consisting entirely of grain products. The management systems that govern Quintarn's operations demonstrate the Ultramarines' characteristic attention to detail and long-term planning. Tech priests assigned to the world monitor ocean conditions continuously, tracking temperature variations, current patterns, and the chemical composition of seawater that affects crop growth rates. The data collected feeds into predictive models that allow administrators to adjust cultivation schedules and platform positions to maximize yields while avoiding areas where conditions prove suboptimal. This level of sophisticated management requires substantial investment in monitoring equipment and trained personnel, resources that most agri-worlds cannot afford, but that the ultramarines consider essential for maintaining efficient production. The result sees Quintarn operating at productivity levels that exceed comparable ocean farming worlds by significant margins, producing more food per square kilometer of cultivation area through superior management rather than simply exploiting workers more ruthlessly. The tragic fate of Prandium serves as a cautionary tale that imperial strategists and planetary governors reference when discussing the existential threat that Tyranid hive fleets pose to agricultural worlds. Prior to its consumption by hive fleet behemoth, Prandium ranked among the most productive agri-worlds in the eastern fringe, a planet whose fertile soil and favorable climate allowed for yields that fed multiple hive worlds across several neighboring systems. The world's population numbered in the billions, workers who tended vast grain fields and operated processing facilities that converted raw crops into the dense nutritional blocks that sustained Imperial Guard regiments and hive world populations. The planetary governor maintained adequate defenses by the standards of agricultural worlds, with PDF forces that regularly trained and orbital platforms that could engage approaching threats. None of these preparations proved remotely adequate when Hive Fleet Behemoth identified Prandium as a target and committed forces to its consumption. The initial Tyranid assault on Prandium followed patterns that Imperial forces have since documented across dozens of worlds that fell to the Hive fleets, though at the time the scale and nature of the threat remained poorly understood by defenders who had never faced such enemies. Mycetic spores rained down across agricultural zones in numbers that overwhelmed the defense platform's ability to intercept them, each spore delivering organisms specifically adapted for rapid consumption of the planet's abundant biomass. Hormagaunts and termagants swept across grain fields in living tides that devoured crops and workers with equal efficiency, their feeding frenzies consuming months of growth in hours. The PDF forces attempted to establish defensive perimeters around population centers and critical infrastructure, but the sheer numbers of Tyranid organisms made such efforts futile, as defenders found themselves surrounded by enemies advancing from all directions simultaneously. The consumption of Prandium proceeded with horrifying speed as Tyranid forces established the infrastructure necessary for complete planetary biomass extraction. Capillary towers rose across former agricultural zones, organic structures that grew from processed biomass and extended tendrils deep into planetary crust while reaching toward orbit. Digestion pools spread across the landscape, biological constructs, where smaller Tyranid organisms deposited consumed organic matter for processing into nutrients that fed the Hive fleet's reproduction cycle. The Imperial Navy attempted orbital bombardment to destroy the capillary towers and slow the consumption process, but the Tyranid bioships in orbit engaged Imperial vessels in battles that prevented sustained bombardment campaigns. The few Imperial Guard regiments that reached Prandium before it completely found themselves fighting a losing battle against an enemy that viewed their casualties as irrelevant and possessed no supply lines to disrupt or command structure to decapitate. The final transmission from Prandium came from the planetary governor's fortress as Tyranid forces overran the last defended positions, a desperate plea for evacuation or reinforcement that arrived too late for any response to matter. Imperial forces eventually reclaimed Prandium's system after Hive Fleet Behemoth's defeat at Muck Crag, but the world they found bore no resemblance to the productive agri-world that had existed before the Tyranid invasion. The planet's surface had been scoured of all organic material, its soil reduced to sterile dust, and its atmosphere transformed into toxic gases that served no purpose for human life. The agricultural infrastructure that had produced food for billions lay in ruins, destroyed by Tyranid consumption or Imperial bombardment during futile attempts to slow the invasion. The loss of Prandium's production capacity created food shortages across multiple systems that had depended on its output, contributing to famines that killed millions and demonstrating how the destruction of a single agri-world creates cascading consequences throughout entire sectors. The Macharian Confederacy encompasses hundreds of worlds conquered during Lord Solar Macharius's legendary crusade into the galactic west, territories that expanded the Imperium's borders further than any campaign since the Great Crusade itself. Among these conquered worlds, dozens received classification as Agri-Worlds after administratum surveyors identified their potential for food production that could support the Imperium's expanded territory. The integration of these agricultural planets into imperial supply networks proceeded gradually over the centuries following Macharius's death and the subsequent fragmentation of his conquests, as bureaucrats worked to establish tithe obligations and shipping routes that connected newly claimed worlds to the broader imperial economy. The agri-worlds of the Macharian Confederacy demonstrate characteristics shaped by their histories as independent human civilizations before imperial conquest brought them into compliance. Many of these worlds maintained agricultural traditions stretching back to the dark age of technology farming methods that survived Old Night's isolation and continued functioning through millennia of separation from Terra. The administratum faced decisions regarding whether to preserve these traditional methods or implement standard imperial agricultural practices, calculations that weighed the efficiency of proven imperial techniques against the risks of disrupting functioning systems. Some worlds received massive technology transfers that transformed their agricultural operations to match imperial standards, while others continued using traditional methods that produced adequate yields without requiring substantial investment in new infrastructure. The populations on Macharian Confederacy agri-worlds include descendants of the original settlers who lived through the conquest and integration into the Imperium, creating cultural dynamics that differ from agricultural worlds colonized directly by imperial expeditions. These populations maintain memories of independence and traditional governance systems that the Imperium tolerates provided they do not interfere with tithe collection or imperial authority. Local festivals and cultural practices that predate imperial conquest continue in modified forms, blended with imperial creed theology, in ways that the Adeptus Ministorum accepts as adequately orthodox. The ecclesiarchy maintains stronger presence on these worlds compared to typical agri-worlds, recognizing that populations with living memories of pre-imperial existence require more intensive indoctrination to ensure proper faith and loyalty. Talisar represents a specialized ocean farming world whose production focuses on protein supplements that supply nearby sectors with essential nutritional components unavailable from grain-based agriculture. The world's surface consists almost entirely of water, with minimal land masses that support only the administrative infrastructure and orbital elevator systems necessary for shipping harvests off-world. The actual food production occurs on massive floating platforms that drift across Talisar's oceans, following currents and temperature patterns that optimize growing conditions for the engineered algae and kelp strains cultivated in vast underwater farms. The platforms themselves house populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands, workers who spend their entire lives on these mobile installations, and rarely if ever set foot on solid ground. The protein produced on Talisar gets processed into supplements that provide essential amino acids and vitamins that grain-heavy diets lack, products that improve the nutritional adequacy of rations distributed to Imperial Guard regiments and hive world populations. The processing facilities on the cultivation platforms transform raw algae and kelp into dried blocks that remain stable during extended storage and transport, concentrating nutritional content while reducing volume to minimize shipping costs. The resulting products taste uniformly unpleasant despite various attempts to improve palatability through additives or processing modifications, but their nutritional density and production efficiency make them valuable components of imperial food distribution networks. Populations consuming Talisar protein supplements as regular parts of their diets demonstrate better health outcomes compared to those subsisting entirely on grain-based rations, though the improvement represents movement from terrible to merely bad rather than achievement of actual nutritional adequacy. The grain worlds throughout the segmentum solar that feed Terra's teeming billions operate under scrutiny and pressure that exceeds anything experienced by agricultural planets in more distant regions, as failure to meet tithe obligations could result in starvation on humanity's throne world itself. These agri-worlds receive priority for resources and technology that might not reach planets in frontier sectors, creating agricultural operations that achieve maximum possible efficiency through superior equipment and management. The Administratum monitors these worlds with obsessive attention to detail, maintaining representatives who track production statistics and verify that harvests meet projected yields. Any indication of problems receives immediate investigation, as the consequences of food shortages on Terra itself could trigger political crises that threaten the stability of imperial governance at the highest levels. The populations working on segmentum solar grain worlds understand that their labor directly sustains Terra and the institutions of imperial power centered there, a knowledge that the Adeptus Ministorum leverages to motivate workers through appeals to duty and sacred purpose. Preachers deliver sermons emphasizing that every grain harvested feeds the servants of the God Emperor himself, that their work sustains the Adeptus Terra bureaucrats who administer his realm and the Astra Militarum soldiers who defend it. This theological framing transforms agricultural labor into acts of devotion that connect individual workers directly to the Imperium's highest purposes, creating psychological incentives that supplement the material punishments used to enforce productivity on less favored worlds. The result sees these grain worlds maintaining output levels that approach theoretical maximums despite the human costs of such intensive production, as workers literally sacrifice their health and lives to ensure Terra never faces food shortages that might disrupt the Imperium's governance. The vast bureaucratic machinery that manages agricultural production across the Imperium operates through layers of specialized offices whose complexity defies comprehension even for those who spend lifetimes working within the system. The Adeptus Terra maintains entire departments dedicated solely to agricultural logistics, massive complexes on Terra itself, where thousands of adepts labor over data slates and cogitator banks that process information from agri-worlds scattered across the galaxy. These bureaucrats work in dimly lit chambers filled with the constant clicking of calculation engines and the scratching of styluses on parchment, their lives consumed by the endless task of tracking crop yields, calculating tithe obligations, and coordinating shipments across distances that light itself takes years to traverse. The Divisio Agriculturae represents the primary administratum organ responsible for overseeing food production throughout imperial space, a department whose authority extends to every world classified for agricultural output. Within this division, specialized sub-departments handle specific aspects of the agricultural logistics network. The Adeptus Exactus maintains records of every agri-world's production capacity, soil quality ratings, and historical yield data stretching back centuries or millennia. Adepts within this sub-department spend their entire careers updating files on individual planets, incorporating new survey data, and adjusting projections based on reports that arrive years after the events they describe. The information they maintain fills archive chambers that extend kilometers beneath Terra's surface, vast repositories of parchment scrolls and data crystals that contain humanity's accumulated knowledge of agricultural production across 1 million worlds. The Officio Prognosticar employs specialized adepts trained in statistical analysis and probability calculation to project future crop yields based on historical patterns, environmental data, and the complex variables that affect agricultural production. These prognosticators work with information that arrives through astropathic transmission or physical data shipments, attempting to predict harvests that will occur months or years in the future based on planting reports that might already be obsolete by the time they reach Terra. The calculations involve accounting for growing seasons on thousands of worlds with different orbital periods and axial tilts, weather patterns that vary unpredictably, and the countless factors that might affect yields between planting and harvest. The prognosticators produce reports that estimate total food production across sectors and segmentums, projections that the Adeptus Munitorum uses to plan military supply requirements, and that civilian administrators reference when calculating food distribution to dependent populations. The accuracy of these projections varies wildly depending on the quality of incoming data and the unpredictable nature of agricultural production across galactic scales. A projection might prove remarkably accurate for stable agri-worlds with centuries of consistent production, while completely missing catastrophic crop failures on planets where unexpected environmental disasters or enemy raids destroyed harvests. The prognosticators understand that their calculations represent educated guesses rather than reliable predictions, but the Imperium requires these estimates to function even when everyone involved recognizes their limitations. Military campaigns get planned around projected food availability that might not materialize. Hive worlds receive assurances of incoming shipments based on harvests that enemy action prevents from ever occurring, and the entire system lurches forward on foundations of uncertainty that occasionally collapse into famine and crisis. The Adeptus Munitorum maintains its own agricultural logistics offices that operate parallel to the Divisio Agriculturae, creating redundant bureaucracies that theoretically provide checks against errors, but frequently result in conflicting directives and jurisdictional disputes. The Munitorum's focus centers on ensuring adequate food supplies for the Astra Militarum, calculating the nutritional requirements of billions of soldiers deployed across thousands of active war zones, and coordinating shipments from Agri-Worlds to supply depots to frontline forces. Munitorum logistics officers work from data that includes troop strength reports, casualty projections, and campaign duration estimates, attempting to ensure that military forces receive adequate rations without diverting so much food from civilian supply chains that dependent populations face starvation. The distribution scheduling conducted by Munitorum offices involves coordinating shipments across shipping routes that span entire sectors, accounting for warp travel times that vary unpredictably and the limited cargo capacity of available transport vessels. A logistics officer planning supplies for a crusade must identify which agri-worlds along the supply route can provide required food types, calculate how much each world can contribute without failing its civilian tithe obligations, and arrange for chartist captains or naval transport vessels to collect and deliver the supplies. The scheduling assumes average warp transit times based on historical data, but actual journey durations might vary by months or years depending on warp storm activity and the skill or fortune of individual navigators. This uncertainty forces logistics planners to build substantial time buffers into their schedules, ordering shipments to depart months before supplies will actually be needed in hope that they arrive before stockpiles exhaust. The tithe assessment process that determines each agri-world's specific obligations involves calculations so complex that specialized adepts spend decades learning the methodologies and formulae passed down through generations of bureaucrats. The assessment begins with baseline data about the world's total arable land, current cultivation percentages, and soil fertility ratings drawn from the most recent survey reports. Adepts then apply correction factors that account for the world's climate patterns, available water resources, and the efficiency of its agricultural infrastructure. Additional modifiers adjust for the world's strategic importance, its position along major shipping routes, and any special circumstances that might affect production capacity. The resulting calculation produces a tithe obligation expressed in standard nutritional units, a number that might reach into the billions or trillions depending on the world's size and productivity. These tithe assessments get reviewed and potentially adjusted on cycles that span decades, as the administratum's bureaucratic processes move with glacial slowness, even when dealing with critical matters. A world might continue operating under tithe obligations calculated based on survey data that is generations out of date, required to meet production targets that no longer reflect its actual capacity. Planetary governors can petition for tithe reductions if circumstances change dramatically, but the petition process itself takes years and requires extensive documentation that proves the need for adjustment. The administratum approaches such requests with deep suspicion, aware that governors have every incentive to exaggerate problems in pursuit of reduced obligations. Most petitions result in rejection or minimal adjustments that fail to address the underlying issues, forcing worlds to continue struggling under inappropriate tithe burdens. The transportation of agricultural products across interstellar distances presents challenges that dwarf the difficulties of production itself, as food represents cargo that degrades over time and requires specific environmental conditions to prevent spoilage. The Chartist captains who dominate commercial shipping throughout the Imperium operate specialized vessels designed for agricultural cargo, ships whose holds incorporate refrigeration systems and environmental controls that maintain optimal storage conditions for different food types. The largest bulk haulers feature entire decks configured as grain storage compartments, vast spaces filled with processed grain packed in moisture-sealed containers that protect against the humidity fluctuations and temperature variations that occur during warp transit. Other sections of these vessels maintain frozen storage for protein products that would spoil rapidly at ambient temperatures, their refrigeration systems drawing enormous power from the ship's plasma reactors. The refrigeration technology employed on agricultural transport vessels operates through a combination of mechanical cooling systems and stasis field generators that slow molecular activity in stored food. The mechanical systems function similarly to those used throughout the Imperium for preserving perishable goods, using heat exchangers and coolant circulation to maintain temperatures well below freezing. The stasis fields represent more sophisticated technology derived from STC fragments, creating zones where time itself flows differently and biological decay processes occur at drastically reduced rates. Food stored within properly functioning stasis fields can remain fresh for years or decades despite spending that entire time in transit through the warp, emerging at destination worlds in conditions nearly identical to when it entered storage. The stasis generators require constant maintenance by tech priests who understand their operation, as any malfunction could result in field collapse that allows entire cargo holds of food to spoil within hours. The acceptable loss percentages that the administratum builds into shipping calculations acknowledge the grim reality that substantial quantities of food never reach their intended destinations. The bureaucrats who plan agricultural logistics expect that between 10 and 20% of shipped food will be lost to various causes during transit, a range that increases for longer routes or shipments passing through regions with active warp storm activity. These losses occur through multiple mechanisms that shipping companies and imperial authorities accept as inevitable rather than problems requiring solutions. Warp translation accidents sea vessels emerge from the Imperium in wrong systems or time periods, their cargoes lost along with ships and crews. Pirate raids target lightly defended cargo haulers, with raiders either stealing food for their own use or simply destroying it to deny the Imperium resources. Equipment failures allow refrigeration systems to malfunction or stasis fields to collapse, spoiling entire cargo holds before anyone realizes problems exist. The most disturbing loss mechanism involves warp contamination that renders food unsafe for consumption despite appearing physically unchanged. Cargo that spends extended periods in the warp sometimes emerges tainted by energies that defy detection through conventional testing, but cause illness or worse in populations that consume it. The administratum maintains protocols requiring that all food shipments undergo inspection by sanctioned psychers who can sense warp taint, but the sheer volume of cargo moving through Imperial supply networks makes comprehensive psychic screening impossible. Most shipments receive only cursory inspection or none at all, with tainted food occasionally entering distribution networks and causing outbreaks of mutation or madness in consumer populations. The Inquisition investigates such incidents when they come to light, but by that time, the contaminated food has typically spread across multiple worlds and affected thousands or millions of people. The strategic food reserves that the Adeptus Munitorum maintains on fortified depot worlds throughout the Imperium represent attempts to create buffers against the supply disruptions that inevitably occur across galactic distances. These depot worlds occupy strategic positions along major shipping routes or near regions with high concentrations of military activity, their surfaces covered with massive storage facilities designed to hold food sufficient to sustain entire crusades for years. The reserves include all food types necessary for maintaining armies in the field, from basic grain products and protein supplements to the specialized rations required by different troop types and environmental conditions. The storage facilities themselves incorporate the best preservation technology available to the Imperium, with climate-controlled chambers, stasis field generators, and redundant power systems that ensure stored food remains viable despite spending decades in reserve. The fortification of depot worlds reflects the Munitorum's understanding that these reserves represent targets of enormous strategic value to any enemy seeking to disrupt Imperial military operations. The storage facilities exist within fortress complexes protected by void shields, defense laser batteries, and garrison forces drawn from veteran Imperial Guard regiments. Orbital defense platforms surround depot worlds in numbers that dwarf the protection afforded to typical Agri-Worlds, creating defensive networks capable of engaging entire enemy fleets. The Munitorum accepts the substantial resource cost of maintaining these fortifications as necessary investment in protecting supplies that might determine the outcomes of entire campaigns. A depot world lost to enemy action could starve Imperial forces across multiple sectors, creating cascading military failures as armies run out of food and lose combat effectiveness. The management of strategic reserves involves constant cycling as the Munitorum rotates stock to prevent food from exceeding safe storage durations, even within stasis fields. Older reserves get shipped to active military forces or distributed to civilian populations, while fresh supplies from Agri-Worlds replenish depot inventories. This rotation process requires careful coordination between depot administrators and logistics officers planning military supply shipments, ensuring that reserves remain fresh while still maintaining adequate stockpiles for emergency use. The bureaucratic complexity of tracking which food lots entered storage when in scheduling their rotation creates employment for thousands of adepts whose entire careers involve maintaining inventory records and calculating optimal rotation schedules. The decision to release strategic reserves for use involves high-level deliberations within the Adeptus Munitorum, as depleting these stockpiles for current operations risks leaving the Imperium vulnerable to future crises. Sector commanders facing supply shortages can request access to depot reserves, but such requests require extensive justification and approval from officials who weigh immediate military needs against the strategic value of maintaining untouched reserves. The Munitorum generally releases reserves only when supply chain disruptions prevent normal shipments from reaching military forces, or when unexpected campaign extensions exhaust planned supply allocations. Even then, the quantities released typically fall short of requested amounts, as the Munitorum maintains portions of reserves as untouchable emergency stocks that can only be accessed under the most extreme circumstances. The communication networks that coordinate agricultural logistics across the Imperium depend entirely on astropathic transmission, as no other method allows for faster-than-light communication across the vast distances separating worlds. The Adeptus Astra Telepathica maintains choir installations on major Agri-Worlds and administrative centers, facilities where sanctioned psychers bound to the astronomic ascend and receive messages through the warp. These astropaths work in specialized chambers shielded from external distractions, their minds linked through arcane rituals that amplify their psychic abilities and allow them to project thoughts across light years. The process of sending even simple messages requires enormous effort and concentration, with astropaths entering trance states that leave them physically and mentally exhausted for days afterward. The content transmitted through astropathic communication consists primarily of condensed data about crop yields, harvest schedules, and shipping arrangements, rather than detailed reports that would overwhelm the limited bandwidth available. An astropath might transmit a message stating that a specific agri-world completed its harvest and expects to ship a certain tonnage of grain on particular dates, information compressed into psychic impressions that receiving astropaths must then interpret and translate into written reports. The interpretation process introduces substantial potential for error, as psychic impressions lack the precision of written language and different astropaths might understand the same transmission in varying ways. Receiving stations employ multiple astropaths who independently interpret incoming messages and compare their translations, attempting to identify the most accurate version through consensus. The delays inherent in astropathic communication create situations where administrators make decisions based on information that might be months or years out of date by the time it reaches them. A message sent from an agri-world in one segmentum to Terra might take 6 months to a year to arrive under optimal conditions, longer if warp storms disrupt astropathic transmission, or if the message must relay through multiple choir installations. The response to that message faces similar delays on its return journey, meaning that a query and its answer might span 2 years or more. Agricultural administrators learn to plan around these delays, making decisions based on projections and assumptions rather than current information. A logistics officer on Terra calculating food distribution for a distant sector works with harvest reports that describe conditions from years in the past, attempting to extrapolate current production levels from historical data that might no longer reflect reality. The coordination of harvest schedules across multiple agri-worlds supplying the same destination requires astropathic communication networks that span entire sectors, with messages flowing between planetary governors, administratum offices, and shipping coordinators. A hive world dependent on food from a dozen different agricultural planets needs those worlds to stagger their harvests and shipments to ensure continuous supply, rather than overwhelming the destination with simultaneous arrivals followed by long gaps with no incoming food. The coordination of such schedules involves years of advance planning, with administrators sending messages that specify when each agri-world should plant specific crops to achieve harvest timing that aligns with overall supply requirements. The inevitable delays and communication failures mean that actual harvest timing frequently deviates from planned schedules, creating situations where multiple shipments arrive simultaneously, while other periods see no incoming supplies despite desperate need. The astropathic choir installations on agri-worlds themselves operate as isolated enclaves separate from the general population, fortified compounds where psychers live under constant supervision by Adeptus Astra Telepathica handlers. The local populations view these installations with mixture of reverence and fear, understanding that the psychers within enable communication with distant imperial authorities, but also recognizing the dangers that unsanctioned psychic activity represents. The astropaths assigned to agricultural worlds typically come from the lower tiers of psychic ability, individuals whose powers prove adequate for routine communication, but who lack the strength for more demanding assignments. They spend their lives transmitting harvest reports and receiving administrative directives, their existence consumed by the endless flow of agricultural logistics data that keeps the Imperium's food distribution networks functioning. The failure of astropathic communication networks during warp storms or other disruptions creates blind spots where entire sectors operate without contact with higher imperial authorities for extended periods. Agricultural worlds caught in such communication blackouts continue producing and shipping food based on their last received instructions, but they cannot report problems, request guidance, or receive updated orders. The isolation can last months or years depending on the severity of warp disturbances, during which time conditions might change dramatically while administrators elsewhere remain unaware. Harvests might fail due to unexpected environmental disasters, enemy raids might disrupt production, or worlds might face crises requiring immediate assistance that never arrives because no one beyond the affected system knows problems exist. When communication eventually resumes, the backlog of messages and the need to reconcile reality with outdated assumptions creates enormous administrative burdens as officials attempt to understand what actually occurred during the blackout period. The imperial cult manifests on Agri-Worlds through theological interpretations that transform agricultural labor into sacred acts of devotion, with the emperor venerated as the divine harvester whose will guides every seed planted and every crop gathered. The Adeptus Ministorum recognizes that populations engaged in endless physical toil require spiritual frameworks that provide meaning beyond simple survival, and the ecclesiarchy has developed extensive agricultural theology over 10 millennia of imperial history. Preachers on these worlds deliver sermons that emphasize how the emperor's divine providence manifests through successful harvests, how his protection wards crops against blight and pestilence, and how every worker laboring in the fields serves as an instrument of his will. The theological concept positions the emperor not as a distant figure concerned only with battles and politics, but as an active presence in the agricultural cycle itself, a divine farmer who tends to humanity's needs through the labor of his faithful servants. The imagery employed in agricultural theology draws heavily from ancient Terran farming traditions, blended with imperial iconography, in ways that make abstract religious concepts concrete for populations whose lives revolve around cultivation. Cathedral frescoes on Agri-Worlds depict the emperor holding a scythe rather than a sword, his golden armor replaced with simple robes as he walks through grain fields blessing the harvest. Stained glass windows show him planting seeds that grow into mighty trees bearing fruit in the form of human worlds, visual metaphors that connect agricultural work to the Imperium's expansion and survival. Saints associated with the Imperial Creed get reimagined through agricultural lenses, with warrior saints depicted carrying farming implements alongside their weapons and martyrs shown dying in defense of harvests rather than fortress walls. These adaptations allow the Ministorum to maintain theological orthodoxy while presenting the Imperial Creed in terms that resonate with agricultural populations, whose experiences differ radically from Hive world dwellers or Forge world tech adepts. Saint Aspera occupies a position of particular veneration on agricultural worlds throughout the Imperium, her legend centered on prayers that supposedly ended a devastating drought afflicting multiple agri-worlds in the Segmentum Pacificus during the 38th millennium. The historical records maintained by the ecclesiarchy describe how Aspera, herself the daughter of agricultural workers on a grain world facing catastrophic crop failure, prayed continuously for 40 days and nights without food or water. On the 41st day, rain began falling across the affected worlds in patterns that meteorological data could not explain through natural causes, breaking the drought and saving billions from starvation. The Ministorum canonized Aspera within a century of these events, and her feast day now coincides with the beginning of planting seasons on thousands of agricultural worlds. Workers pray to Saint Aspera when weather patterns threaten crops, seeking her intercession with the emperor to bring rain during droughts or clear skies when excessive precipitation threatens to rot grain in the fields. Saint Geryon represents another figure whose cult holds particular significance on Agri-Worlds, though his legend involves protection against plague rather than weather intervention. The ecclesiarchy's official accounts describe Geryon as a planetary governor who refused to ship tithes from his agricultural world when he discovered that a warp-borne plague had contaminated the harvest. Despite facing execution for tithe failure, Geryon ordered the entire crop burned and the affected fields purged with promethium, preventing the plague from spreading to the dozen hive worlds that depended on his planet's production. The Inquisition eventually confirmed that Geryon's actions prevented a pandemic that would have killed billions, and the Ministorum recognized his willingness to accept personal martyrdom to protect others as evidence of exceptional faith. Workers on Agri-Worlds pray to Saint Geryon for protection against crop diseases and contamination, and his icon appears frequently on storage facilities and processing plants, where his blessing supposedly guards food against spoilage and taint. The blessing of seeds before planting represents one of the most widespread agricultural rituals practiced across Imperial Agri-Worlds, ceremonies that combine practical preparation with religious observance in ways that blur the distinction between the two. The ritual typically occurs at the beginning of each planting season, with workers gathering at local shrines or temporary altars erected in the fields themselves. Ecclesiarchy preachers arrive to conduct the blessing ceremonies, bringing with them sanctified oils and incense that they claim carry the emperor's favor. The seeds destined for planting get spread before the altars in vast quantities, tons of grain or other crop varieties arranged in patterns that form crude aquilas or other imperial symbols. The preachers walk among the seeds while reciting prayers in High Gothic, sprinkling sanctified oil and wafting incense smoke across the assembled masses of grain. Workers observe these ceremonies with genuine reverence, believing that blessed seeds will grow more vigorously and resist diseases better than unblessed varieties. The Adeptus Mechanicus maintains complicated relationships with these blessing rituals, as tech priests recognize that the ceremonies serve primarily psychological purposes rather than producing measurable effects on crop yields. However, the Mechanicus also acknowledges that worker morale affects productivity, and populations that believe their seeds carry the emperor's blessing demonstrate higher motivation and better care in their planting work. Some tech priests assigned to agricultural worlds participate in blessing ceremonies, adding their own machine cant prayers and anointing seeds with sacred oils used in equipment maintenance rituals. This cooperation between the Ministorum and Mechanicus creates hybrid ceremonies that satisfy both theological requirements and technical considerations, with preachers blessing seeds for spiritual protection, while tech priests verify that seed stock meets quality standards and remains free from contamination or genetic degradation. The blessing of agricultural tools and equipment follows similar patterns, with workers bringing their implements to shrines for sanctification before each growing season begins. Hand tools used by laborers on primitive agricultural worlds receive simple blessings from local preachers, prayers that ask the emperor to guide the tools' use and keep them sharp and functional. The sophisticated harvesting machines employed on mechanized agri-worlds undergo more elaborate blessing ceremonies, conducted jointly by ecclesiarchy officials and tech priests, rituals that combine prayers for the emperor's favor with technical inspections and maintenance procedures. The machine spirits inhabiting these devices supposedly respond favorably to proper religious observance, becoming more cooperative and reliable when operators demonstrate appropriate reverence. Workers learn to perform daily devotions before activating their equipment, brief prayers and offerings of incense that acknowledge the sacred nature of the technology they operate. The daily existence of the average agricultural worker on an imperial agri-world consists of physical labor that begins before dawn and continues until darkness makes further work impossible, a routine that varies little regardless of season or weather conditions. Workers rise in communal barracks or cramped family dwellings as alarm bells or sirens announce the beginning of another workday, their bodies aching from the previous day's exertions and facing the certainty of more pain to come. The morning meal, when provided at all, consists of thin gruel or dense grain blocks that provide calories without any pretense of palatability, food consumed quickly before workers must report to their assigned fields or facilities. Overseers conduct headcounts and issue work assignments, directing laborers to specific tasks based on current agricultural needs and the season's demands. The work itself varies depending on the world's level of mechanization and the crops being cultivated, but it universally involves physical demands that exceed what populations on more developed imperial worlds would consider reasonable or sustainable. Workers on primitive agricultural planets spend their days bent over rows of crops, using hand tools to plant seeds, remove weeds, or harvest mature plants. The repetitive motions required for these tasks create chronic injuries that accumulate over years, with workers developing permanent damage to joints and muscles from the constant strain. The heat during growing seasons becomes oppressive in open fields with no shade, while rain turns soil into mud that makes every step an exhausting struggle. Workers receive minimal breaks for water or rest, as overseers push for maximum productivity and view any pause in labor as wasted time that reduces overall output. Mechanized Agri-Worlds replace some physical labor with machine operation, but this shift creates different challenges rather than genuine improvements in working conditions. Machine operators spend long hours in the cramped confines of harvester cockpits or tractor cabs, their bodies subjected to constant vibration and noise that causes hearing damage and joint problems. The machines require constant attention and adjustment, with operators monitoring dozens of systems and controls while maintaining awareness of their surroundings to avoid accidents. Equipment breakdowns occur frequently despite the tech priest's maintenance efforts, and operators must perform field repairs using whatever tools and parts they have available. The pressure to maintain productivity means that damaged equipment gets patched together with improvised fixes rather than properly repaired, creating dangerous conditions where malfunctioning machinery might crush or mangle inattentive operators. The communal living arrangements that house agricultural workers reflect the Imperium's prioritization of production efficiency over human dignity or comfort. Worker habitations on most agri-worlds consist of massive barrack structures that pack thousands of individuals into spaces designed for maximum occupancy rather than livability. Sleeping quarters feature rows of bunks stacked 3 or 4 high, with minimal space between them and no privacy for individual workers. Families share single bunks or small partitioned areas that provide barely enough room for parents and children to sleep, with no space for personal possessions beyond the clothes workers wear and perhaps a few small items of sentimental value. The barracks lack climate control beyond basic heating in cold regions, leaving occupants to suffer through temperature extremes that make sleep difficult during the hottest or coldest periods. Sanitation facilities in worker barracks operate at levels that barely prevent disease outbreaks, with communal latrines and washing areas that serve hundreds or thousands of people. The water provided for washing runs cold and often carries sediment or chemical residues from agricultural runoff that irritate skin and eyes. Workers queue for access to facilities during the brief periods between work shifts, creating situations where individuals must choose between washing and eating during limited rest times. The Administratum considers these conditions adequate provided they do not reduce worker productivity through illness or death rates that threaten labor availability. Improvements to living conditions require resources that planetary governors prefer to allocate toward agricultural infrastructure or tithe shipments, as better housing provides no measurable increase in crop yields that would justify the investment. Rural settlements on less densely populated agri-worlds offer slightly better conditions than communal barracks, with workers living in small structures built from local materials that at least provide family units with independent dwellings. These settlements sprawl across agricultural zones, clusters of simple buildings housing the workers who tend nearby fields. The structures themselves rarely include more than 1 or 2 rooms, with entire families sharing spaces that lack running water, electricity, or any amenities beyond basic shelter. Workers build and maintain their own dwellings using techniques passed down through generations, creating architectural styles that blend practical necessity with local traditions. The settlements develop informal social structures as families form relationships with neighbors and communities, establish customs that provide some sense of identity beyond their status as agricultural laborers. The limited access to advanced technology that characterizes life on most agri-worlds extends beyond agricultural equipment to affect every aspect of daily existence. Workers on primitive agricultural planets might never encounter devices more sophisticated than simple mechanical tools, living lives that would be recognizable to farmers from ancient Terra. Medical care consists of folk remedies and basic first aid rather than proper treatment, with serious injuries or illnesses typically resulting in death or permanent disability. Communication between settlements relies on messengers traveling on foot or animal back, as vox casters and data slates remain beyond the means of common workers. Entertainment consists of oral storytelling, simple musical instruments crafted from local materials, and whatever diversions workers can create from their limited resources and scarce free time. Even on more developed agri-worlds with mechanized agriculture, the technology available to workers remains strictly utilitarian and focused on production rather than improving quality of life. The harvesting machines and processing equipment represent sophisticated devices maintained by tech priests, but workers' personal lives feature no comparable technological advantages. Living quarters lack data slate access or vid screens that might provide entertainment or information from beyond the immediate area. Communication with family members working in distant agricultural zones requires physical travel or messages passed through official channels, as personal vox units remain too expensive for workers to afford on the minimal compensation they receive. The technological gap between the equipment used for agricultural production and the conditions in which workers live creates stark contrasts, where individuals operate machines worth more than their entire settlement's combined value, while returning to dwellings that lack basic amenities. Cultural traditions on agri-worlds develop around the agricultural cycle, with harvest celebrations representing the most significant events in the yearly calendar and providing rare opportunities for workers to experience something beyond constant labor. These festivals coincide with the completion of major harvests, periods when crops have been gathered and processed, but before the next planting cycle begins. The Adeptus Ministorum carefully controls these celebrations, ensuring they reinforce imperial theology and serve practical purposes for the administratum, rather than allowing purely secular festivities that might harbor pre-imperial traditions or heretical elements. The festivals combine religious observance with tithe ceremonies, as workers celebrate successful harvests while simultaneously witnessing the fruits of their labor being prepared for shipment off-world. The harvest festivals typically begin with religious services conducted by ecclesiarchy preachers, lengthy ceremonies where workers gather to give thanks to the emperor for his blessing of another successful growing season. The preachers deliver sermons emphasizing that the harvest resulted from the emperor's divine favor rather than simply the workers' efforts, reinforcing theological doctrine that positions all good fortune as flowing from him. Workers offer symbolic portions of the harvest at shrines and altars, bundles of grain or other crops that get blessed by preachers before being ceremonially added to the tithe shipments. These offerings serve both religious and practical purposes, as the symbolic gestures satisfy theological requirements while the actual food enters the supply chain destined for off-world consumption. The celebrations that follow the religious services provide workers with rare opportunities for leisure and social interaction beyond the immediate demands of agricultural labor. Planetary governors or estate administrators typically authorize the distribution of extra rations during festival periods, allowing workers to consume food beyond their normal subsistence allotments. The additional food rarely includes anything that could be called luxurious, but the simple fact of eating until full rather than remaining perpetually hungry represents a significant improvement over daily conditions. Some worlds produce local alcoholic beverages from crops unsuitable for tithe shipment, and festival periods see controlled distribution of these drinks under supervision, meant to prevent excessive consumption that might lead to disorder. Workers gather in communal areas to share meals, tell stories, and participate in simple entertainments like singing or dancing that provide psychological relief from the grinding routine of agricultural labor. The passage of agricultural knowledge through generations occurs primarily through oral tradition and practical demonstration rather than formal education. as most Agri-World populations lack the literacy or educational infrastructure that would enable written transmission of farming techniques. Children born into agricultural families begin learning their future trades almost from birth, accompanying parents into fields as soon as they can walk, and gradually taking on age-appropriate tasks that build toward full participation in agricultural work. Young children might collect fallen grain or carry water to workers, simple jobs that familiarize them with agricultural environments and begin their conditioning to accept constant labor as normal. As they grow older, children receive instruction in specific skills like identifying crop diseases, operating hand tools properly, or recognizing when plants have reached optimal harvest maturity. The knowledge transmitted through these informal educational processes includes both practical farming techniques and the folk beliefs that agricultural populations develop around their work. Experienced workers teach younger generations which planting methods produce best results in local soil conditions, how to predict weather patterns through observation of natural signs, and which traditional practices help prevent crop failures. These lessons blend empirical knowledge accumulated over centuries of agricultural experience with superstitions and folk wisdom that may or may not have any actual effect on outcomes. Workers learn that planting during certain moon phases supposedly improves germination rates, that specific prayers recited while sowing seeds protect crops from pests, or that carrying particular charms wards against equipment failures. The Adeptus Ministorum tolerates these folk beliefs provided they remain subordinate to proper imperial theology and do not involve practices that suggest heretical influence. The intertwining of folk beliefs with imperial doctrine creates syncretic religious practices that characterize agricultural spirituality across many agri-worlds, blending ancient traditions with ecclesiarchy-approved theology in ways that satisfy both workers' cultural needs and the Ministorum's requirements for orthodoxy. Workers might pray to the emperor using formulas that incorporate pre-imperial agricultural deities reimagined as aspects of his divine nature, or they might venerate local saints whose legends combine historical figures with older mythological characters. The ecclesiarchy carefully monitors these practices through preachers stationed on agricultural worlds, intervening when folk traditions drift too far from acceptable orthodoxy, but generally allowing considerable variation, provided the emperor remains the ultimate object of worship and no obviously heretical elements appear in local customs. The rare instances where agri-world populations achieve genuinely better living conditions than the grim standard occur through exceptional circumstances that combine multiple favorable factors rather than representing systematic improvements in imperial agricultural policy. Some worlds achieve higher production levels than projected through superior management or favorable environmental conditions, creating surpluses beyond tithe requirements that planetary governors can theoretically use to improve worker welfare. Enlightened governors who recognize that healthier, better-fed workers maintain productivity more effectively over long periods might invest these surpluses in improved housing, better medical care, or enhanced rations for their populations. These improvements remain modest by the standards of more developed imperial worlds, perhaps providing workers with actual beds rather than bunks, access to basic medical treatment, or rations that include occasional vegetables alongside grain blocks. The proximity to benevolent Space Marine chapter homeworlds creates situations where agricultural populations benefit from the Astartes' presence through spillover effects of the chapter's governance philosophies. The Ultramarines maintain direct control over Ultramar's agri-worlds, implementing management practices that balance production demands against long-term sustainability and population welfare. Workers on these worlds live under conditions that would seem luxurious to their counterparts on typical agricultural planets, with actual family housing, reasonable work schedules, and access to medical care that prevents minor injuries from becoming permanent disabilities. The Ultramarines recognize that well-treated populations prove more loyal and productive over the long term, accepting reduced short-term extraction in favor of sustainable systems that maintain agricultural capacity across centuries. Other chapters with similar governance philosophies create comparable conditions on worlds within their spheres of influence, though the number of such worlds represents a tiny fraction of the Imperium's total agricultural planets. The salamanders maintain particularly close relationships with civilian populations on worlds near their nocturne homeworld, extending their chapter's emphasis on protecting humanity to include ensuring adequate living conditions for agricultural workers who supply their fleet and garrison forces. The salamanders intervene when they observe exploitation or abuse that exceeds even the Imperium's brutal norms, using their authority as space marines to compel improvements in worker treatment. These interventions remain limited in scope and cannot address the systemic problems inherent in imperial agricultural production, but they create islands of relative decency within a galaxy where such consideration for common workers rarely exists. The populations on these fortunate worlds understand their exceptional circumstances and maintain fierce loyalty to the chapters that protect them, viewing the Space Marines as literal angels who shield them from the worst excesses of imperial governance. The legacy of agricultural labor shapes the Imperium's survival in ways that rarely receive recognition from those who benefit from the endless food shipments arriving from distant worlds. The workers who spend their lives in fields and processing facilities, who endure conditions that would break populations from more comfortable circumstances, who sacrifice their health and futures to meet tithe obligations, these billions of nameless laborers make possible the continued existence of hive worlds, forge worlds, and the military forces that defend humanity against its countless enemies. Their labor receives no glory, no recognition beyond the cold statistics tracked by Administratum, adepts calculating production quotas. They live and die in obscurity, their individual existences mattering only as components in the vast machinery of imperial agricultural production. Yet without their sacrifice, the Imperium would collapse within months as starvation swept through dependent populations and military forces lost the ability to campaign. The agricultural workers of the Imperium's countless Agri-Worlds represent the foundation upon which humanity's galactic civilization rests, unsung heroes whose endless toil sustains an empire that offers them nothing but suffering in return for their service to the God Emperor's realm.